If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this.
Skeptics turn believers, share your most convincing and scariest paranormal, demonic, or dark entity sightings and experiences.
Well, I used to reside in the Grover area, which was connected to Kings Mountain to the west of Charlotte. A friend and I were in my backyard chopping on a tree because we were bored. We were about 13 or 14 years old at the time. He stopped chopping and stared off into the forest line. He then started to whisper my name about 3 times and then grabbed my arm. I turned around and said, "What?" And that's when I saw it too. A 6-ish foot tall humanoid dog or wolf creature, standing on its hind legs with one hand on a tree, was staring out down the forest line. We stared at it for 20 seconds until it turned its head our way and looked at us. We both dropped our machetes and ran into the house freaking out. Looking out the bathroom window that overlooks where we were, it moved off after we started running, I believe. Because we didn't see it. We stayed in the house for a whole week. No one believed us at the time. That was 9 years ago. We still talk sometimes, but he doesn't want to go back into detail about what we saw that day. First-hand experiences. My grandparents' house was built in the 1880s or 1890s. There is no accurate documentation except a photo from 1894 with the house in it, and we've felt/seen a ghost cat and a man wearing an early 1900s soldier uniform. My mom's house was originally built as military base housing, then converted to a small doctor's office where the doctor killed himself. The bullet hole was still in the wainscoting in my sister's room, then moved and made into a house again. In my mom's house, it was pretty scary at times. We had cabinets open and dishes fly out of them across the room and break. We heard footsteps on the roof. 1-story house, nobody in the attic crawl space. Certain rooms would be 15 to 20 degrees colder without air conditioning in the summer. We had a wooden cross fly across the room, abruptly change direction, and break as it hit the ceiling. The most memorable moment, though, was what made me believe in ghosts. My little sister was about 5 at the time. My mom asked me to go in her room to get clothing to do laundry, and my sister ran in, put her arms around me, and gave me a friendly hug. I didn't think anything of it when she ran out and left. She would normally do this. I picked up the clothes, left the room, and asked my mom why my sister couldn't gather her laundry. "You know she's at school right now, that's why," my mom replied. I was about 8 years old and was just hugged by a child ghost when I wasn't paying attention. My husband has an EVP on an old school recording device from when he was in the military. He, along with some friends, embarked on a ghost hunting expedition at a local cemetery known for its haunted stories. They took the recording while they walked around and tried the old "is there anyone here?" thing. You can hear an unidentified voice, almost like a child saying help, and something coming at them at one point because the other person behind him starts to panic. My husband tells his friend to chill and then yells stop, and whatever it was stopped approaching, but you can hear the movement very clearly. It sends chills up my neck when I hear it. He had an event that made him eventually stop trying to find more evidence, hearing someone go SHH very loudly in his ear while driving alone. He whipped his head around, legitimately thinking someone was in his truck with him. He never went hunting again for fear of having something attach itself. We have tried contacting local ghost hunters and asking them to retrieve the EVP and analyze it with new technology, but no one gets back to us. Without having physical proof of it, we both witnessed a partial apparition late one night. We were driving down a road that's a single-car dirt road, with an open cliff and large reservoir at the bottom. It's a well-known area for accidents and deaths because people go camping there but drive recklessly. We were headed back after hanging out by the water one night when our headlights highlighted some movement. It was only the bottom half of a person, partially transparent, walking towards the cliff. It was visible for a brief couple of seconds but plenty long enough to know 100% what we saw. We both had tears in our eyes with that feeling of we gotta go. I think we checked our rearview mirror about 100 times on the rest of the drive. When I was a kid, I lived out in the woods with my family. Our neighbors' houses were visibly close to ours, but no closer than that. During the night, it would be black outside, with no other light than a distant window. This house was known for being haunted. We once had a medium over to look at the house. The medium didn't even enter the house, as she stated that it was like a highway for paranormal activity. One night, I was staying up late during a weekend, waiting for my parents to go to sleep. They were watching a movie from their home country. As I was born and raised up here, my parents instead came from another country. Then eventually they went to sleep. I turned on my computer and started doing all the kinds of things a kid does on a computer. Playing some games and such. I played some Elder Scrolls, Skyrim. I played as a magic user. Later this night as I was preparing to sleep, I was watching a movie. Suddenly, I could hear something outside. It sounded like a person running. But as I put more thought into it, I noticed that it was running much faster than what a person should be able to. The footsteps were not as heavy as any moose, nor as elegant as any deer. Then, it stops right outside. It stops instantly, without any deceleration. It's at the main door. The main door leads inside, and then there is a hallway with a set of stairs and a door. The door leads into the living room, where I currently am. And at the window, facing toward the main door, I sit. I look through the window, I can't see anything moving, all I see is complete darkness. Something begins to happen, I start hearing something. I turn off the movie. And I listen, I guess I can only describe it as crows talking. I try to listen to what is being said, I can't hear any details, though. But it sounds like a conversation. I try to focus some more, and I focus only on the conversation. Suddenly it stops, just as I am thinking that I am about to figure out what is being said. I then get this odd feeling that whatever it was that was talking had figured out that I was listening, somewhat as if it could read my mind. Now I start hearing slow and steady footsteps from out in the hallway right outside the living room. The main door didn't even open. The footsteps walk towards the door that leads to me. Once it's at the door, it stops. I listen for a moment, waiting for the door to open. Then the footsteps start to slowly go towards the stairs instead. I hear it walking steadily up the stairs and then through the door on the second floor. The footsteps continue to walk until it's standing right on top of me, up on the second floor. I am now currently standing, paralyzed. And then, it continues, but now it was moving towards a different location. Right next to the room I was currently in was the room that my parents were currently sleeping in. I heard it open the door, and it stepped into their room. It all went silent, and it stayed dead silent for the rest of the night. And this sums up a type of experience that could be expected weekly in our old house in the forest. I was already a firm believer, but this happened to me, and there's literally no explanation. I lived in an old, 1862, Victorian shotgun house with my partner at the time. It was about 2015. No roommates. And the house was set up where it's long, and the front door connects to the living room, then the small wood stove room, and then the kitchen, and then the bathroom all the way at the end of the house in a straight line. Anyway, I woke up one morning at like 9 or 10 a.m. and went out to the living room as my partner went to the bathroom at the other end of the house. She left the door open because it's only us in the house. Anyway, suddenly I heard, plain as day, as if it was right in front of me, in a very clear, loud male voice, "Look what we have here." And I froze for a moment. When I tell you it was loud, I mean it. It was booming. Like a man was right in front of me in the living room. But of course, no man lived there. It was so prominent that my partner heard it from the bathroom and said, "What did you say?" And I was like, that wasn't me. Now you may be wondering this, but we just woke up, so no TV, computer, or phone was on. I didn't even have my phone with me, and neither did she turn hers on yet. Also, we lived on a very quiet street, and the way our front door was set up was that you had to enter the fenced yard and go up steps to get to it. So it wasn't anyone outside or at the door. We never heard a male voice like that in the house again. At about 2:30 p.m. on Monday, August 17, 1970, an incredibly hot and humid day, a young boy flagged down the ambulance I was driving with my partner. We were returning to the hospital from a call where the patient refused treatment and transportation. The boy, about 12 with messy, uncombed blonde hair, said his mom was sick in the apartment on the corner. We radioed our location and followed the boy upstairs, where a pregnant woman was lying on the floor of a steaming hot kitchen, unconscious. The boy said his name was Victor and his mom was Millie. We applied oxygen and checked vitals. A cop responding to our radio call arrived and asked how we found her. We told him Victor flagged us down. The cop, in a sweat-stained blue shirt from the heat, looked at us puzzled and then asked if Victor was a blonde boy with messy hair. We said yes and called his name. "Hey Victor. Where are you?" The cop shook his head and told us Victor was struck by a car and killed the summer before. I grew up in a haunted house. I have a ton of stories. But one that people here seem to like is about my kid, not me. Purple Mommy. Never get tired of telling the Purple Mommy story. Purple Mommy. When my son was first learning to talk, he would tell us about something called Purple Mommy. It could be an imaginary friend, but these details are a little bit creepy. Here are a few of the Purple Mommy details. Purple Mommy is all purple with long hair and bright, all white eyes. At the time he mixed up purple with black, so he could have meant she was all black. Purple Mommy picks him up at night and turns off the lights. We would often find my son out of his crib in the morning, which would mean him crawling over the railing into the ground, at a time when he was barely walking. Definitely found the lights in his room off a few times too, even though he's terrified of the dark. Purple mommy needs a bandage because she has blood everywhere. Purple mommy has no smile, meaning a mouth. Purple mommy can take her head off. Purple mommy really doesn't like daddy. He shared this information with us for approximately a year or longer. If we ever asked where she was, he'd always point to the same spot. A corner of the room behind his open closet door. He would also wake up crying almost every night during this period. Once, during a really rough night, my wife went to ask him what's wrong, and his answer was, "Purple mommy won't let me sleep." I'm a pretty huge skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts or demons or whatever else. There was one thing, though, that made me question what's really going on in the universe. It's the only paranormal thing that I can't completely explain, and it isn't related to spirits or whatever. I was driving home from work last year talking to my girlfriend over the phone. I had been driving for a while and was almost home. I turned onto a narrow dirt road and moved along at 35 miles per hour or so because I knew better than to go any faster, having seen plenty of accidents on these roads from people treating them like asphalt. Further down the road I can see a truck coming, and he is absolutely blasting down this road going at least 70. I quickly swerve my car to give this guy plenty of room to go by me, and he misses me by a couple feet. As soon as this happened, the call dropped. Not unusual given the shitty reception out here, so I give my girlfriend a couple seconds to call me back. About a minute later, she calls, and as soon as I pick up, she breaks down and bursts into tears. Full on bawling. I'm confused as hell, and eventually, I calm her down enough to talk, and she explains that she heard a massive slamming noise with grinding and crumbling metal followed by the sound of my car's interior beeping. She yelled my name into the phone over and over again after hearing all this, and then the call dropped for her. She tried calling back 4 or 5 times before it finally went through. She heard that truck slam into me and almost certainly kill me, but I was fine. The truck went right by me without a scratch. The skeptic in me says it was just technology bugging out again, but never in my life have I heard of it bugging out exactly like it did. The timing with the truck too is just too much of a coincidence for me to ignore. I call my girlfriend every single day after work, and never has it done that when the call drops. I have no idea what the hell happened, but assuming it wasn't just the phone being weird, my best guess is that there was some weird parallel universe shit happening. I guess you can say I was a skeptic before I was 7. That's when I had my first spiritual encounter. I woke up one night. My room was pitch black, yet a tall figure emerged from the corner that was somehow much blacker. It was like the classic shadow figure. Its silhouette was pure shadow, except for 2 tiny, shimmering eyes of light. It had a slight air of familiarity, so at first I thought maybe it was my mom. I asked, "Mom?" No reply. It slowly continued its way toward me. As it got closer, I could feel its aura more clearly. I could feel it's not my mom. Warm, yet also cold and stark. Tangible and distinct, but hard to describe, overall mysterious, neutral feeling when it comes to whether or not it was good or evil. It stopped above me and then leaned its face over mine. I quickly hid my face under my covers in absolute terror. I continued to feel its presence over me. After what felt like a long time, I slowly peeked my eyes out of my blanket. At that moment the shadow creature began to move away from me, disappearing into the same corner of the room it came from. I can't say I really believe in fairies or spirits in the forest, because I haven't experienced too much that would indicate they exist. I will share a weird story with you, though. I was camping with my so on the edge of a cornfield. I live in a very rural location. I got out of the tent and walked about 20 feet away. I was right next to the tree line, and I squatted to pee. So there I am, trying my hardest not to piss on my shoes, and I hear something little approaching me from the woods. It's dark, it's November, and I can't see anything since it's an overcast night, but I do hear the crunching of leaves and twigs as something gets closer to me. Then it sounds like it's coming right up to me. I jerk up my ants, and it sounds like it's right beside me, like maybe it's 2 to 3 feet away, but I still can't see anything. Typically, raccoons, rabbits, mice, etc. don't come up to humans, and they especially aren't aggressive in approaching people. Maybe they might if they have rabies, but I'm not honestly sure. In any case, it sounded like an animal that had some weight to it. Every time I'd take 3 to 4 jumps back, it sounded like it was following me. I feel like I should have been able to see something as big as it sounded, but I couldn't make anything out. I didn't hear any animal sounds like grunting, hissing, or anything like that. Nothing touched me either, but I was jumping around in crazy circles to avoid whatever it was. At the point where I was literally running in circles to avoid this thing, I started to get a little scared and yelled for my so. He jaunts over, and lo and behold, it stops. We can't see anything, and the noise of crunching leaves that I was hearing has stopped. He laughs at me and says he wondered why I was jumping around like a weirdo. Later that night we did hear more movement in the tree line. I also heard a very strange noise. It sounded almost like a human voice, but not quite. It wasn't English or any language I could recognize. It sounded like a mix between a grunt, a gurgling, and a word. When I asked him if he heard the weird voice noise, he said no, but the next day when I talked about it more, he admitted that he had heard it. He said he didn't want to admit to it in the tent because he didn't want to scare me. Lol. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure it's what you're looking for. Maybe someone listening to this will have some ideas, though. Yes. I've seen ghosts with my own two eyes multiple times in my life, and I absolutely cannot come up with any other plausible explanation. There have been 3 particular occasions specifically that stuck in my mind that can't be explained. The others I could maybe accept as seeing things or whatever, but I don't believe that. I saw the spirit of the old woman who haunts my parents' house standing clear as day in front of me. She stood there for about 5 to 10 seconds before slowly fading in front of my eyes. My mother had the exact same experience some years before. I and 2 others were all, at the same time, witnesses to the shadow of a person walking directly before us across a room from one side to the other. We all turned at the same time and watched and all looked back at each other with a "Did you just see what I just saw?" None of us drink, smoke, or whatever else. It was clear as day. I was at my workplace when I heard and watched a door shut, and the figure of a person walked from the door, across the room in front of me, and went into the bathroom. I followed them in there, and no one was there. Absolutely no way a person could have gone anywhere from that room. There was only one door in and out. I can't explain those things away. There is no other explanation. There just isn't. So yeah, I believe 1000%. I was a skeptic until my mid-20s. I mean, I'm a fairly reasonable guy. I never believed in anything paranormal and would roll my eyes when people would tell me stories. But one day I saw something in my room just looking at me. The object was simply there, lacking any discernible shape, yet it was present and in motion. I remember just not even being able to comprehend that there was a person or thing just in my room, like my heart stopped in fear. Even typing it makes me have goosebumps again. I remember pinching myself and being like, maybe this is sleep paralysis. I was fully awake, that's how maddening it was looking at it. I was certain this was not real. I could hear it too. But then it just vanished. And I was just sitting there debating if I should run, call the cops, or whatever. Was I going insane? That was the only way to explain it. To this day I have no idea what that was. I even told myself, as I get older, I'll start to doubt if it happened, but just remember it felt real. No matter what you convince yourself in the future, it felt real, and you were awake. My first experience was when I was 14. I got a job at the local convenience store as the cooler/bottle boy. There were 2 ways for me to get to the store. The first way was to walk the roughly half mile to the end of my street, take a right-hand turn, and then backtrack that same distance on the main road. The other way was to cut through the yard of our neighbor, which led to a field across from which was the store. The neighbor did not mind, and in the winter he would clear a path through the snow to said field. One choice took roughly 30 to 40 minutes, while the other was about 5. The neighbors were always my choice. His property ended in a cornfield. Both the cornfield and his yard ended with a thin wooded patch, maybe 30 feet across. The cornfield also had a creepy barn at the tree line. Anyway, I worked from 7 to 9 at night, which meant in the winter I walked in the dark. No biggie that. Until the night I met my first entity. I was on my way to work and had reached the tree line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention, but I attributed that to my being cold. To my left, in the wooded area, was a swampy area. It always had standing water. Since it was winter, the water was frozen. As I was about midway through the trees, I heard the distinct sound of ice cracking. Anyone that has walked across ice knows this sound well. I froze. I could feel that I was being watched. Somehow, I found the strength to turn toward the sound, and I saw this black, almost shapeless thing about 15 feet from me. It had the shape of a person at the top, head and shoulders, but not much else for form. While it was dark out, I could see it clearly enough and also noted that I could see the trees that were behind it, through it. I stood there a moment, my feet unwilling to move until he lunged towards me. I have never run so fast in my life, through snow that was knee-deep. I swear that I would have placed first in the 100m at the Olympics. I reached the road and did not even look to see if there were any cars. I just sprinted across and into the store. That night, I decided I was imagining things, and when it was time to go home, I used the field again. As I neared the tree line, though, I was covered in goosebumps, and my flight or fight instinct kicked into overdrive, and I sprinted through the trees and the rest of the way home. That was the last time I took that shortcut in the dark. I still get chills writing this, even though this was 37 years ago. I always wanted to share one of my experiences with what I believe was a dryad, nature spirit. It could be many things, as there are many different names and versions of nature spirits. This incident occurred during my childhood and took place in the northern regions of Minnesota. When I was younger, my family loved being a lot more outdoorsy, and every summer my dad would take me and my biological brother, I have 4 brothers, only one of which shares the same dad as me, camping with his side of the family, and my mom would bring all of us up to our great-uncle's cabin. This experience happened at the cabin. We were up at my great-uncle's cabin and were staying up there for around 2 weeks. Because it was in a more remote location, and because the times were very different back then, we didn't really have to fear anything or other people, so we were often allowed to just run around by ourselves and explore. The 3rd day we were up there, a few of my brothers went swimming, and I decided to just explore the forest around us. I've never been great with math, so I couldn't really say how far I went, but I was pretty far from the cabin, and all that was around me was trees. After what was like 30-40-ish minutes of just walking and exploring, I came upon this really pretty clearing in the woods, circular in nature. A rather large rock was in the center of this lush clearing, covered with a dark green moss. A few wooden logs were in the clearing as well, also moss-covered, and there were varying flowers, and I think even a few berry bushes as well, but I don't know much about plants, so it might have just been bushes that looked like they had berries. Anyways, I remember finding the location to be breathtaking and serene. I walked out into the center of it near the rock and sat atop one of the logs and just let the world melt away and enjoyed the sounds, smells, and comforting embrace of the natural world. I basically wound up meditating in that spot for a while, just enjoying the precious moment for a while before wanting to climb up on the rock. As you can assume, a moss-covered rock, especially one as large as it was, isn't the easiest thing to climb on and have a good grip while doing so, but after a while I finally managed to get on top of it. For a brief moment at least, before my footing slipped and I slammed down to the ground, with a loud thud, and a very audible snapping sound came from my arm, and I remember screaming in pain. Not long after I started screaming, I heard a really soft and calmly toned voice from a woman and noticed her sitting atop one of the logs. She had long, dark brown hair similar to mine, her skin was really tanned, her eyes were as green and bright as the leaves and plants around us, also topless, but her bottom half was covered in a skirt-like clothing that looked like it was made of leaves and flowers. I don't remember what she said, but I remember it had instantly made me stop screaming and had me feeling really calm. She walked over to me and grabbed some moss from the rock and took my arm and placed the moss on the part of my arm that was experiencing pain, and I remember her beginning to mutter things, but I didn't really make anything out of it as it sounded like a gentle wind to me. I remember a warm sensation coming from the moss and spreading over my arm, dulling the pain until it was basically non-existent. She then took out a circular piece of bark, basically as if someone had fashioned tree bark into a cup. It was filled with water, and she had me drink it. The flavor I remember being a very bitter, earthy, tea-like flavor. Once she saw that I was no longer in pain, she stood up, gave me a cheery smile, placed a few fingers under my chin, lifted my head slightly, and stared into my eyes. She then smiled again, placed a kiss on my forehead, turned, and started to walk towards a tree, vanishing into it like a doorway. While I did try to describe her as best I could, her appearance was etheric in nature, perfect and beautiful. Her touch was soft and warming, her hair was long, practically down to just below the butt, she was tall, obviously, as a child, every adult is gonna be tall, but I'd say she was probably around the 7 feet range. She smelled like the tea tasted, earthy, flowery, and kind of like rain/damp leaves. That wasn't the only experience I had with her, but it was the closest one in terms of physical proximity. Throughout the rest of that week, there were several occasions when I would be swimming and she would be standing at the tree line around the cabin, watching me. Alternatively, we would be driving back to the nearest town or shopping place to get food or something for the cabin, and I would see her in the woods dancing or simply smiling and waving at me. She made such an impression on me that one of my OCs and D&D characters is a druid based entirely off of her. I became a believer when I was a little girl. I can't remember how old I was, but our golden retriever, Remy, had passed away. I was there with my parents to bury her, to say goodbye. Later that day, I was standing by the front of our car, and I saw Remy walk behind it. I could see through her. I screamed and ran to my mom. My dad's story of becoming a believer is that he was a paramedic and got a call to a nursing home. My dad was 100% a non-believer. He always had a logical explanation. He and his partner got to the nursing home. While his partner was in the room with the person that needed help, my dad saw an elderly man walking away from him with a walker. My dad, for whatever reason, went to follow him. The man turned down another hallway with my dad right behind him. The man disappeared into thin air. He couldn't have gone anywhere but through the door at the end of the hallway. He truly terrified my dad. This is by far the scariest paranormal encounter I've ever had and made me a believer at a very young age. I was 11 at the time when this happened, and to this day, my friend and I act like it never happened because it shakes us to the core. I was hanging out with my friend during the summer when her mom and both of her grandparents were working. They all lived in this very old farmhouse, and there was a cornfield behind the house. Keep this in mind throughout the story. Again, we were home alone, hanging out in her room as we usually did. Her cat was running up and down her hallways, and we didn't think much of it because, well, it's a cat. It's what they do. A few minutes go by, and my friend uses the bathroom across the hall, so she leaves the bedroom door open. All the bedroom doors were open because she had 6 cats. At this point, the cat that was running up and down the hall was now in her grandmother's room. He began hissing and doing that high-pitched meow that cats make when they don't want to be messed with. I get off the floor and peek my head around the corner, and my friend exits the bathroom, and we're now standing there looking into her grandma's room. She asks me if I'm hungry, and I say yes, so as we go to leave the hallway, we see a white train to a long dress quickly move to the other side of the room in her grandparents' room. We look at each other and try to ignore it as we walk down the hallway, but her cat zoomed out of the room, which made us turn around. Her grandma's mirror was hanging on the wall directly in front of the bedroom door, which means if you look down the hall into her grandparents' room, you'll see your reflection. That being said, we saw a tall, dark figure behind us in a white gown through the mirror. Whatever this entity was, they let out the most ear-piercing scream I've ever heard in my 24 years of existing on this planet. We booked it downstairs, and as we were running down the steps, we heard heels clicking on the floor and giggles coming from behind us. We got outside and stayed there until her mom got home, which was around 6 in the afternoon. As we told her what happened, my friend and I saw a pair of glowing eyes in the field. It could have been an animal since it was summer, but we aren't stupid. It was a bit too convenient. The story doesn't stop there. That night we calmed down, watched a movie with her family, and then went to bed. It was around 11:30 when I got up to use the bathroom. I closed the door, locked it, and took care of my business. As I was sitting there, I heard one of the cats, or what I thought was a cat, scratching at the door. Her cat Oreo always liked sleeping in the bathroom sink. As I went to get up to flush, I saw an eyeball under the door staring at me. I never screamed so loud in my life. I unlocked the door and ended up screaming even more when I collided into her mom. I still feel awful to this day for waking everyone up because it was so late. I told her what happened, and my friend and I slept with her that night with a lamp on along with the TV. We couldn't sleep. I still talk to my friend now and then, but we grew apart due to the fact that I stopped going over there. I was there all the time, and I gradually stopped going over. I had a few encounters in that house, but nothing compared to that one. No one believes us except for her mom due to the terror on our faces. Ever since then, I've been a firm believer. I also practice witchcraft now as well, so I'm very open-minded. My first paranormal experience was one that I only fully understood as an adult. When I was a kid, there was this great old abandoned house off Tidewater Drive at a point on Waynes Creek in Norfolk, Virginia. A long driveway led to it, and my friends and I frequently went back there to run around this huge property, up on the wraparound Victorian porch and a broken-down pier, that as an adult I would recognize as an emergency room trip waiting to happen. Anyway, one late fall afternoon, we were there doing what we usually did, running around like chickens with our heads cut off, screaming and chasing each other. I ended up running around the back of the house that faced the water. It was that great time of afternoon/year when everything's all shiny and gold, and I was transfixed by the light on the water and the windows, and then I noticed behind the glare there was a woman standing there behind the window. She was black, she had her hair pulled back in a light-colored bonnet, she had on a calico blouse, and she was wiping her hands with a rag. She was looking out the window with a look on her face that I didn't understand until I was an adult. Although she was, like me, admiring the beauty of the creek, she was worn out and thinking of a happier place or time other than there and then. Then she vanished from sight. I get goosebumps even typing this now. I started to believe that night. So I've always been interested in the dark, creepy, weird, paranormal stuff from a young age and developed a love for horror films as well. I watched Child's Play and Night of the Living Dead as my first 2 horror films and loved them. As I've gotten older, I started to branch out beyond horror films and watched paranormal stuff involving aliens, cryptids, demons, and general high strangeness. While I've always been eager to learn new things, I've never considered myself a believer. I want to see it so I can believe it. You know? So I call myself an open-minded skeptic. I've lived at the same house most of my life, and there have been things over the years that have been odd or weird, but never anything I'd call proof of paranormal activity. Swearing you've seen a shadow move by you in the basement, you hear someone talking when you're home alone. The regular spooky shit all hauntings have. But nothing ever made it clear to me that my house was haunted and ghosts were real until an event a few years ago that scared the ever-loving shit out of me because I had no way to explain it. So I live in Ohio, and July/August can bring miserable heat, and I have no central air. So open windows and fans were what we used. My mom was working third shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so it was me and my brother. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning, and my brother had already been in bed a couple of hours at this point. I was ready to sleep, so I started shutting off the lights around and checking the doors, making sure everything was locked. The entire main floor of my house was dark aside from the hall light. So, to describe the layout of my house, the hallway has a sort of uppercase eye to it. To my left is my mom's room, to my right the kitchen, and behind me the living and dining room. Then there's the hallway. At the end, to the left, are the stairs leading up to my room. To the right is the bathroom. Going straight is our back porch. To get a breeze we had the porch door open at night when it was cooler. I walked down the hallway with the hallway light as the only light source I had. I got to the porch door to shut it, and immediately in the darkness of the porch, something makes a sound that I compare to movies when someone is running to an elevator as the doors are closing and they're trying to get someone in the elevator to hold the door, a sort of mumbled wait. No. 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 And this faceless audio was right there at the door as if trying to get me to leave the door open. I felt a rush of air come at me as this mumbling was uttered, getting goosebumps as I write this in total fear. I slammed the door as hard as I could and ran down the hallway into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. In the moment, expecting it was some sort of intruder who had broken into my back porch and was trying to get into the house to do who knows what. I stood in the dark kitchen just out of sight of the back door and just listened. Waiting to hear a person try to either get in the house or exit the porch, and it was silent. Just silence. Nothing. I walked around the darkened areas of the house looking out windows for something. I walk into my mom's room and peek through her window at the view of the porch and still see nothing. Hear nothing. Still silence. I paced around the darkness for a good 15 minutes on edge waiting for something, someone. Yet nothing. After I convinced myself that no one was out there, I slowly walked the hall and shut that light off. It was total darkness now, and I peeked out the porch window to see the door. Closed. Locks are still in place. It was nobody. What did I hear? What came rushing at me? That was the day I became more than an open-minded skeptic. I believed. Something without a physical form spoke at me and came toward me. It terrified me beyond belief. I reside approximately an hour away from a location near Bryson City known as the Road to Nowhere. It's a tunnel about maybe 200 feet long that's connected to a hiking trail. I've only been on the trail a few times, but most of my experiences happen in the tunnel. I've been growled at, had rocks thrown, and scratched. I've seen 2 red eyes glowing in the darkness. Shadows moving. You know the usual. I've gotten 2 really good EVPs. But by far the best experience I had was one night a group of us from work went. And the general consensus is that there are 3 spirits in the tunnel. A little girl, her mother or possibly sister, and a spirit I call the old man. But there was a fairly large group there one night, about 10 of us, and we asked if the little girl, I've nicknamed Rosie, could come out and dance for us. About 2 minutes later, all of us started seeing these 2 big, bright blue orbs start playing tag with each other and start spinning around each other, like they were dancing. We tried getting on camera, but nothing ever showed up, and every time we put lights on, the orbs disappeared. We stood there about 5 minutes watching this till the orbs moved away from us, got to the entrance of the tunnel, and danced up a hill. The Road to Nowhere is my favorite place to go investigate just for that experience. I've got one that I still can't explain. I was 17, working at a scout camp, and a few of us, guys and girls, decided to hop in my car and drive from the spot the staff was camping in over to the far side of camp where there's a small shack with electricity. We were going to charge our phones, play cards, and shoot the shit. Well, it's the middle of the night, so we're going pretty slow. Also, no one wants to hit a camper walking out of their tent, but pretty soon we get past all the campsites where groups were staying, and then it's just about a 7 to 8 minute drive at about 15 to 20 miles per hour. As we go, we hit this big switchback where the road curves back and forth 3 times to make the hill climb easier on people walking, so we're taking the switchback, and we round a corner, and my headlights flash over this figure. There's just some kid, maybe 14 or so, wearing a cowboy hat, right in the middle of the road, looking straight at us, and even though I slam the brakes, my car slides on the gravel, and I hit him. We all hear a thud as he hits the hood and feel the bump as he goes under the front tire. We all sit silently for a moment, with everyone anticipating the worst. We get out, and there's nothing. Not a damn thing in sight. We pull out flashlights and look around for almost half an hour in the surrounding area, still nothing. We all look at each other, and after talking, people are convincing themselves we didn't see what we saw, but I and 2 others aren't convinced. We just say okay, and we drive along and continue with our night, hoping to forget it. We hang out, try to have a good time, and I'm finally thinking it's probably just a trick of the light. The next day, camp is over, we're cleaning up things here and there, helping the ranger do a few small projects before we skedaddle, and as we're going to head out, I see him unloading some wooden cutouts from his truck. They're plywood cutouts of a little kid, wearing a cowboy hat, painted all black. Goosebumps are forming on my arms now. I ask him what they're for. He says he just cut them out yesterday, and he wants to put them up around the roads of the camp, especially in areas where people can't see what's coming, and he uses the example of that exact curve we were on last night. Bad feelings now. I said, why a kid in a cowboy hat? Why not something more scout related? And he said back before he was the ranger, a kid wearing a cowboy hat got hit by a car in camp. He didn't know the details, but the kid had horrible head injuries, and he couldn't remember if he lived or died, but he thought it'd be a bit of a homage to the kid to make them little cowboys. That shit ducking freaked me out, and for years when I went back, I always would go to that road and look at the cutout the ranger put up and try to rationalize what I saw that night. Okay, so I recently moved because I felt I needed a change in my life, and not to mention my old neighborhood was getting pretty rough. So I decided to get a new house in an upper-class neighborhood. As you know, houses with a bigger price range usually have nicer backyards, and at the time I wanted a nice shed or something in my backyard to keep all of my art supplies since it was a hobby of mine. Not only did my new house have a shed, but it also had a sort of small forest in the back. My first instinct was to explore it. I've always loved nature and thought I could maybe get some inspiration for my art, so I opened my backyard gate and started in the woods. It was enjoyable and calming. Although it was kind of hard to walk because sticks were overlapping the grass. The place always looks so pretty in the daytime, but I can really say the same for night. I have a dog who I usually walk right before I go to bed, so I would take her in the backyard to play and tire herself out before going to bed. My backyard was nice, but I had a lot of trees. Except for this one part in the middle of my backyard, there was a gap where no trees would grow, all you could see was the pitch black forest. It always made me feel a bit uneasy, though. Particularly one night my dog was barking so bad even though I took her out 2 minutes ago, so to keep her quiet, I took her out again. For some reason, that little gap was her favorite place to be. As soon as we got outside, she dragged me over there, but this time she didn't seem happy. She kept barking in the direction of the gap that leads into the woods, and her barks kept getting louder and louder. My dog is pretty big, so it was a challenge to get her to come back inside once the girl started barking, but she was well trained and would usually listen to me. At this point my curiosity starting to get the better of me, I tried to focus my eyes really hard to maybe make up an image of why my dog was so angry. Maybe it was a squirrel, I thought to myself. But for a second I thought I could make out a figure of something looking directly at me. Me being me, I don't really get scared easily, and if there was something in my backyard, I was determined to find out, so I yelled, "Why are you hiding?" With no reply, my dog stopped barking. I found that a bit unsettling. The worst part is now every time I walk my dog, she goes onto that exact spot and barks. She will only stop when I acknowledge something is there. I keep an axe in my shed now, although I don't know if that really benefits me. What should I do? 100% yes, I grew up in the Northeast in a very old area. A lot of the original houses and buildings from the 1700s and 1800s are now restaurants. 3 of the 4 I worked at in HS and college I had experiences at: footsteps, breathing on my neck, TVs turning on, heavy velvet carpet moving like a person was behind it, shadow figures, doors slamming, locking, and unlocking. The worst was the kids at a tavern steakhouse in Chadds Ford. It was built in 1756. We were told in the 1930s the farmer who owned them was an alcoholic and a gambler. He put the deed to the property in a poker game and lost. Despondent and hammered drunk, he stumbled home and killed his wife and 2 kids with his shotgun while they slept before turning the gun on himself. You'd see a boy and a girl peeking at you around entryways in your peripherals regularly. It was creepy. We also had a private party room on the second floor that could seat 64 with big circular tables that were draped with long white tablecloths. If it was a late party, there would be usually 2 of us cleaning up by ourselves upstairs. On 2 occasions, I felt and heard what sounded like a boy scurrying underneath the tables. You'd look under there, and it was always empty. The second time it happened, my coworker had already gone downstairs. Out loud, I nicely asked it to stop. Silence. 3 minutes later I was carrying a rack of barware out and walked by one of the tables to leave. All I can say is it felt like a child's hand grabbing and squeezing my left leg right below the knee. It may as well have zapped me with a taser because I freaked the duck out, nearly dropped the rack, and got downstairs immediately. Never worked a party up there after. So yeah, ghosts are ducking real. One night, this would have been back in 1999, my best friend and I were walking back to the subway station after doing some shopping downtown. He was going to spend the night at my place, and we had bought a bunch of stuff for him, like toiletries and some new clothes. Since we were close to my university, I suggested we take a shortcut through campus, because it was the quickest way to the subway station. This was around 8 or 8:30 in the evening. As usual, the university was pretty empty at that time. In fact, I only remember seeing a couple of people on our way through the campus. At one point we were alone and talking about whatever, chewing the fat, when suddenly I heard footsteps behind us. It sounded like someone was right behind us. Being from a very dangerous city, I immediately thought we were going to be mugged. We turned around and no one was there. Then, I swear to God, we heard what sounded like someone banging on the roof of the covered walkway we were walking in. I forgot to mention that all over the college campus there are covered walkways leading from one school to another. It was a very loud banging, and it sounded right above us. My friend and I looked at each other's faces, and at the same time, we ran away from the walkway and onto the street. Just then, and I swear to God this is not a lie, we felt something fly over and away from us. Whatever it was, it felt heavy because it moved the air above us. Then it vanished. This whole paranormal experience must have lasted about 45 to 50 seconds. The strangest thing is that we both felt the same thing. Footsteps behind us, banging on the concrete roof of the walkway, and then something flying past us. During that time we didn't say a word to each other. It wasn't until it was all over that we started talking about what had happened to us, and when we compared what we had felt, we realized that we had both experienced exactly the same thing, in the same order. Needless to say, we ran away from there, and since then we have talked many times about what happened to us and have found no explanation. I'm not saying it was a ghost, but I don't think it was something from this world or this dimension. I really can't find an explanation for it. A thing, a shape. That's what we would refer to it as for the few days my sister was willing to talk about it before she locked that night away somewhere in her subconscious, never to broach the subject again. On December 17, 2017, as I recall, we had just celebrated my brother's 23rd birthday. I was 18, and my sister was 13. My parents had decided to go out to a hotel that night, far enough away they couldn't see the house, close enough to come speeding back if we needed them to, but after what had transpired, I couldn't bring myself to call them. Truthfully, this story isn't even mine to tell, I was only a witness. It's my sister's, we'll call her Elle, and the dogs, Milo and Sarah. Milo was a 97 pounds black lab, not fat, just tall and muscular. Sarah was a 40-pound staffy, and yes, she was a little on the round side. It started at about 10 p.m. that night. My parents had left an hour earlier, and Elle was watching TV with the dogs when she came pounding up the stairs yelling about there being something on the porch, so I ran downstairs and checked out the window. Nothing. It was probably a shadow, I say, brushing aside her panic, but just to be safe, I double-checked that all the doors and windows are locked. About 20 minutes later, she comes bounding back up, it's back, but again, nothing. Convinced she was probably just trying to freak me out, I tell her off and head back upstairs. Nothing happens for another 3 hours, it's about 1:30, and I decide I should probably let the dogs out one more time before I go to bed. I put Sarah out first. She never takes long, then Milo, he's older, so he takes more time. 10 minutes later and suddenly the dogs are going crazy. Sarah's barking and snarling at the door, and Milo is screaming as if something was ripping him apart. The first thing that comes to mind is coyotes. They're out there, and it's winter, they're hungry, and an old dog might seem like an easy meal. Why would they come to such a populated part of town? I didn't think about it. All the same, I'm grabbing my dad's gun and flying down the stairs before I can stop myself, flinging open the door, preparing myself for a gruesome sight, but alas, nothing. Nothing but an obviously terrified dog who bolts inside as if an entire pack was on his tail. I tell myself, somewhat irrationally, as I try to calm everyone down, he probably slipped on some ice, he always was a big baby, and his screaming undoubtedly startled Sarah. Fight or flight, I guess. Elle had different ideas. It tried to grab him. I just know it, she insists. It's at this point I finally ask, what exactly is IT? She responds, I don't know, a shape, a thing. It's not even 10 minutes later that once again chaos erupts downstairs. Sarah is barking, Milo's crying, and Elle is screaming, it's here, it's here. I knew, at that moment, yes, there's something out there, I can feel it, and there's adrenaline and fear, but at the same time a strange sort of excitement running through my veins. This was by far the most intriguing thing to ever happen to me. By this point I've accepted that whatever it is the three of them see, it's not human, most likely not even of this world. I didn't dare call my parents, afraid of whatever it was that could grab them. I brought Elle and the dogs upstairs, knowing that really, a simple change of location wouldn't stop whatever that was outside, but it seemed to put the others at ease. When my parents got home, Elle and I silently decided that the events that happened prior would be left unspoken. Our mother was an avid believer that the paranormal didn't exist and would simply brush off our fears, either that or yell at us for not calling them that night. When asked about it, Elle would simply call it a thing before ignoring it altogether, acting as if it never happened. The dogs too seemed to have forgotten it, and my neighbors, though acknowledging that our dog had woken them that night, say they've never experienced anything like that. So it was up to me, and me alone, to share this experience and see if there was anyone else out there who had ever been visited by it. The dark figures. One night it was around 3 a.m., and I was reading in my bed when suddenly I heard a deep voice whisper to me in my room. I have never experienced anything like this before, and I knew I wasn't hallucinating. I shuffled up quickly and scrambled backwards off my bed. Astonished, I looked around. The entire atmosphere of my room suddenly began to change. It started to become dense, and the lights softly dampened. It felt like being in a strange fog. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a boy appeared before me, and he was a dark black figure in the midst. His body was transparent and three-dimensional. He had very dark clothes with very dark features, and he looked to be about 7 years old. His face was so dark that you couldn't make it out. He slowly started walking towards me from across the room. I stared dead frozen. He continued to walk towards me until he actually walked past me and reached for my door. I took a few steps back. He then placed his hand through the wood of the door and rotated his right hand from right to left, and as he did this, he slowly took his other hand and raised it up above his head and materialized a three-dimensional black transparent orb. He then slowly placed it on the floor. Then he stood up and turned to me and put his finger up to what I assume were his lips and shushed me. He then turned back towards the door and then placed his ear to it as if he was listening for something. Then the orb started to suddenly float from amidst the fog toward me, and I knew I had to get the hell out of there, but it was blocking the door. So I went into the bathroom and locked it. I waited for a while and then opened the bathroom door again, but slowly, to see if everything was gone. The boy was. The orb had disappeared, but now there was something else there hanging from the ceiling light above my bed. A figure a lot older and heavier. I walked over to it and instantly recognized it was me, but I was dark and transparent with no face like the boy's was. I was rotating left and right with the rope around my neck. I looked lifeless. I had mass. I then stumbled backwards a few steps, confused, and mumbled something like, "What the hell?" I ran past myself into the living room and grabbed my keys when I felt everything stop. The atmosphere lightened up and everything disappeared. I checked with a flashlight, but there was no sign of anything. I remember just grabbing a bottle of whiskey on the way out, getting the hell out of there, and spending the next week at a relative's house. I never saw anything like it again. My wife and I moved into my parents' house when my uncle died unexpectedly in 2009. My parents moved in with my grandmother to care for her, so we bought their house. Now this house had been the watering hole for my town back in the day. The well is in my basement. It is a hole in my basement floor covered by a 5-foot wide slate rock. This is important because our priest told us spirits can travel along waterways, which is why every time we bless the house, it is only calm for a few months before things start happening again. Anyways, we move into the house, and things are nice. Everything is calm, and my wife, fiancée, at the time, and I are happy to be out of my sister's house. Once my wife gets pregnant, things kick into high gear. Her shoes go missing on a daily basis when every day she puts them in the same spot after work. One day, when she was in the attic, she heard a woman ask, "Is that my baby?" She said the woman sounded genuinely confused as to whose unborn baby she was pregnant with. Things kept escalating until one night when I was just about to turn off the lights and go to bed when I saw a black mass by my wife's side of the bed. It was pitch black and completely solid. Before I realized what I was looking at, my hand flipped off the lights, and my sleeping wife immediately started speaking in what sounded like French. Since we took French in high school and college, we deduced that she was saying Jamie Suze. This translates to I am myself. The next evening we were at play rehearsal for our local acting group, and we were talking to our friend, Rhonda. As we were talking with her about random bits of small talk, we noticed she seemed very distracted. She kept glancing quickly from side to side, the way you would if you were watching a bug zigzag around a room. We asked what was going on, and she said, I know this sounds crazy, but there is this black thing in the auditorium. Every time I look at it, it moves. I simply can't figure it out. We freak out and immediately tell her our story. We leave the auditorium and call a priest to bless the house. As he is blessing the house, he stops and does a double take at one of the crosses hanging on the wall. After the blessing is over, he asks about it. My wife says it is beautiful, and it called to her. She had to have it, she said. He leaned back and said, that's interesting. It's a Benedictine crucifix. We reply with, okay? He continues, we use Benedictine crucifixes in exorcisms. It is intriguing that this crucifix called to you so strongly. That is my biggest paranormal story. I have a ton of little ones about missing shoes and finding them in the attic, but this event was the turning point for how we view our house. On October 29th, we had a get-together with some friends we went to college with, and we heard 3 loud thumps upstairs. We all ran up to see what had happened and found our bedroom completely trashed. A couple of angel statues were broken, and one had a nail driven through its hand. We took a video of the aftermath. We have since had the house blessed and lit a sage stick and went through each room with it. We've been problem-free for almost a month now. The house has a completely different feel to it as well. I believe I had an encounter with a poltergeist or something similar in the expansive basement kitchen of a country club. I was working there as a restaurant consultant and was finishing up after a post-tournament reception. I was the only person left on the property. We were storing empties in this huge, unused, and dilapidated kitchen downstairs, and I made a few trips down that night with cases, which we were storing on steel wire shelves. Something felt off the whole time, but shit got real on my last trip down. It felt noticeably colder when I got like halfway down the stairs, which was weird as it hadn't felt like that 2 minutes prior. It slid the cases onto the shelf, and just then it got even colder, like an AC vent had opened above me. It was midsummer, and there was no AC on. In that moment, it also felt like there were hands pushing down on my shoulders. I scurried back towards the stairs, and as I went, I could hear the heavy wire shelf shaking hard enough to make bottles clink. Once I got upstairs, I grabbed my keys and booked it. I left the lights on and forgot to set the alarm, but screw it. I immediately called my co-consultant Will and told him what happened. He was horrified, as that room really bugged him already. He's a smart-ass British dude who loves breaking my balls, but there was none of that in this conversation. That was the last time I went into that room, and thankfully I only had to work in that function room above it once more. This was the Glen Ellen Country Club in Millis, Massachusetts. I was not aware, but it was definitely reputed to be haunted AF. It's gone now, with 55 plus condos in its place. I am a 22-year-old boy. I am from a rural village in India, and I had my first experience when I was 19.
So, when I was 19, I and my 2 friends, A, B, decided to go to a newly opened restaurant. It was my treat, so they agreed quickly.
Our plan was to go in the evening at 6:30, but because of B, we were late, so now we leave at 7:15. It was a 30-minute long route, and at that time, I and B didn't know how to drive a bike. Only A knows how to drive a bike. While going to a restaurant, I feel some eerie feelings, but I keep it inside and don't know how to drive a bike. While going to the restaurant, I felt some eerie feelings, but I kept it inside and didn't tell them. It was a pretty empty road, no bike, no car, no light, there is no light pole system, so at night it was almost an empty road. If something happened to us, no one will know until the morning. Pretty dark road. We arrived at 7:45, and because it was my treat, they took some time to finalize their order. Because it was newly opened, it was fully packed, so finally our order came at 8:40, and we were finished at 9:30. I paid and left the restaurant. While going back on that empty black road, we were a little bit spooked. It was a dark road, we only had bike headlights, and suddenly, me and B saw/felt a little girl figure in the middle of the road. Gazing at each other, we made the decision not to inform A about the sighting, given his extreme fear of strangers. If we told him, he would speed up the bike, and if he did on that dark, blackout road, we would die. So while I and B were looking at each other, we felt a tall, dark, hollow silhouette running beside us. When we looked, there was nothing. We were scared, we wanted to tell A, but we couldn't, and A was going slowly at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, enjoying life, but we were literally scared. After a little while, I saw a few people sitting under a light pole and a few houses with lights on, so I thought it was the right time to tell A about this. I started telling him everything. Just when I finished, our bike suddenly stopped. I was looking down at the bike, but our bike didn't start, and then when I looked up, I saw there was a light lamp but no people. The houses were broken and empty. I was scared. B was shouting at me, "Why did I tell A about this?" B started calling someone while they were doing their things. I saw a dark, eerie figure wearing darkish blue. Hollow eyes, minimum 7 feet tall, shirt looking at us. It was really creepy. Then that figure started coming toward us. I was stunned. I was creeped out. Suddenly our bike's engine started, and that thing's speed also increased, so I shouted at A to go at full speed. So he did, 80 to 100 kilometers per hour speed. We escaped, then he dropped everyone at their home and left. Yeah, 3 of us are on one bike because I and B didn't know how to drive that time. Firstly, we Indians are very religious. We truly believe in God and wear mantra-chanted lockets for protection. After that, when I was home alone and sleeping on my bed, I felt my neck feeling slightly light. I touched my neck, and then I realized my locket wasn't there. I panicked and checked and found out my locket was broken perfectly in the middle. I was actually scared, so my brother slept beside me. In the morning I rushed to A's house. I saw him sitting on his bed silently. He seemed disturbed. I asked him what happened, and then he told me, "First you tell me, then I will." I told him everything, but he didn't even flinch. A is a scaredy cat, but he didn't react, and then I asked him what happened to him. He told me that after dropping me off, he went to his house. He was so sleepy that he went to his bed. Immediately, sometimes his father comes to his room and sleeps with him, and this is what happened. His father came to his room, opened the door, closed the door, slept there, and left in the morning. He was half asleep, but when I called him and he woke up, he found out his room was locked inside. But who could have done that if his father left the room in the morning? I don't believe in the paranormal, but I can't explain it. We recently lost our home due to Hurricane Milton. We were lucky in the fact that my husband's uncle's house was available. Unfortunately, his wife died a few years ago, and he unexpectedly passed away a few months ago. Despite this, I had no qualms. I'm a skeptic. This was never even a possibility in my mind. So my family moved in. Me, my husband, the kids, and my mother. My mom went to visit my brother for 2 weeks, and my husband was out of state for work. I sleep during the day because I work late. My kids also do it on school breaks because they stay up late. 2 days ago I woke up at 2:30 p.m. feeling weird. I heard my American Akita growling. She has never barked in her life. No one knows why, but I heard her and looked down the hallway to see her. Maybe 2 minutes after I woke up. Not seconds. I was completely awake. From my side of the bed, if I lean out from the edge, I can see down the hall, through the dining room, into my living room. As soon as I did, I saw something solid. Like a person, it blocked out the light. Go across the entrance to my living room. I thought it was a person. I saw they must have been 7.5 feet tall. So I immediately grabbed my gun and ran out there. The place they walked to was only a tiny corner. It's where my Christmas tree is. I thought there was a person hiding there. I go out, and no one is there. I am 100% sure of what I saw. I was not still asleep. So I go check to see if all 3 of my kids are still in bed. None of them are 7 feet tall anyway, but my birds are going insane, my dog is growing, and my heart is pounding. I thought I had an intruder in my house. There is no way the person could have escaped. I never took my eyes off that doorway. They couldn't have moved. So I walk back to my room, and I'm terrified. I sit on the edge of my bed, leaning over, looking down the hall. About 30 seconds later, the TV and light in my closet flashed off quickly. I thought maybe I was wrong and I just blinked too long because I was scared. About 10 seconds later, the power flashed off and on 4 times. But the weird thing is this, the TV came back on, and YouTube was still on. When my power goes off at my old place, it would always turn off the Roku. This time it did not. At that point I was thinking of running outside and not coming back in ever again. But my kids were asleep in their rooms. So I just sat here, panicking for hours. I had to even cover the mirrors in my room. Because after that, everything made me panic. Every flash, from the TV to the mirror, etc., made me feel anxious. Nothing has happened since, but I'm losing it. I can't help but constantly stare down the hallway terrified. I'm doing it now. Ugh. I don't know, I don't believe in it at all, but I'm 100% sure I saw something. It wasn't black. It seemed to look like a person with clothes on. My husband and daughters have a New Year's trip planned, and I'm supposed to stay here with my 10-year-old, and I'm not sure I can. I have always wished I could have some form of proof. I don't know what this was, but I don't want it anymore. I lived in my old house from about the age of 5 to 12. Most of my time at the house was pretty normal, however, there were some strange moments. The first thing I really remember took place after one of my grandmothers died, and I was probably around 10 years old. I had been getting ready for school and forgot something in my room. Across from my room was a bathroom, and the door was often left open and the lights were often on. As I was exiting my room, I looked into the mirror in the bathroom as the door was open a bit but not completely. When I looked into the mirror, however, I saw a girl probably around the age of 12 or 14 with long, dark brown hair wearing a green shirt. I am blonde, as well as my mom and my sister, so it wasn't one of them messing with me. My grandmother had long brown hair and had once told me her favorite color was green, though. At another point, I took part in this event where you built a small wooden car and would race it. My dad had decided to buy spray paint to decorate it, and because I was 10 to 11, he didn't let me do it, and after using it, it was put away out of my reach and in a place I didn't know. I have an older brother as well as 2 younger siblings. The 2 younger ones would have been too young to get to the spray paint, so it was pretty secure. One day my mom noticed that someone had used the spray paint to write her name on the basement stairs. I don't think my younger siblings did it, nor do I believe my older brother did it. We never did find out who did it when we moved. 2 of the things I remember took place in my bedroom. The first being a time when I had fallen asleep wearing jeans but woke up in shorts. I lock my door when I sleep and even did so when I was younger so my mom wouldn't have been able to come in and change my pants. I also was never known to sleepwalk, and I find it unlikely that I would have been able to take off skinny jeans in my sleep. The other thing that happened in my room happened when I was just sitting on my bed reading or watching TV. My dad works in construction, so he did a lot of work on the house when we moved in, which included fixing the closets in my room as well as my sister's. These closets were insulated and very difficult to open. While I was sitting on my bed, I suddenly heard a bunch of the clothing hangers rattle. As I mentioned, I was sitting in my bed, not jumping around or anything, and my parents, who I shared a wall with, were downstairs. The final thing happened when I was watching a video on my phone when I suddenly heard my mom call my name. I went downstairs and found my dad and brother in the kitchen. When I asked them where my mom was, they told me she wasn't home and had taken my sister to cheer practice a while ago. There were no girls in the house, but I had definitely heard a woman call my name. I have since moved and haven't had anything weird happen in my new house, but I do think that some of the things that happened in my old house were very strange. I didn't mention it, but one of my younger siblings sleepwalked a few times when we lived there, and one time he walked into my room and started knocking on my closet door while calling my name. When I was younger, my sister lived at a rough house in the middle of the ghetto. Me being the younger brother, I admired my sister to bits and stayed at her house regularly nearly every week. Strangely, every time I visited, I would always feel uncomfortable sitting on the couch that was directly next to the kitchen when the door opened. One night, I was getting ready to sleep and sat down on the couch, where my head would be facing the kitchen, and saw an old woman staring at me without moving. Mind you, this was about 1 a.m., and I was super freaked out. I ran for my sister's room and told her what happened and slept in her bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, my sister walked to the window I spotted the woman at, looked down at the ground, and finally noticed that there was a stone that read, Lily 1985. Normally I am skeptical, but since I connected the pieces together, such as the uncomfortable feeling I felt, which my brother and eldest sister also experienced every time I visited, and my sister's dog barking at the window constantly, I believe in the paranormal to some extent. My sister and my brother are the only people who believe me. I don't believe in spirits or anything like that, but today I and 2 witnesses had a strange occurrence. I'm someone that absolutely does not believe in ghosts or spirits or paranormal stuff at all, but today I and 2 witnesses, including a close friend and a cashier at a clothing shop, witness/experience something that simply defies all logical explanation. Because of that I am leaving this here because I'm unsure where else to put it. A friend and I were hanging out today in Cincinnati on Vine Street when we went into a clothing store because she wanted to look at some stuff. At one point we ended up in the back of the store and then decided we were done and wanted to leave. I begin to walk to the door when a shoe from a display stand in the middle of the store simply just flew up over the shoe next to it and then landed right in front of me from just out of nowhere. It literally jumped over the shoe that was right next to it and landed right at my feet. I laughed and started to pick it up. My friend said, "How the duck did that happen?" And the cashier working at the time said something to the effect of, "That was wild, I just saw that shoe jump at you." I picked it up and put it back on the display stand and laughed it off. As I kept walking out, I made a joke about how it must have been Henry the ghost, and we went on our way. Later in the afternoon we stopped at a coffee shop, and when we sat down we reflected on it some more and realized how we brushed off something that we had no explanation for whatsoever and realized how weird it is. Now I can't stop thinking about it because it was so odd. I have the urge to go back to the shop and see if they maybe have security camera footage that hopefully captured the event, because I'd love to know if we all just missed something obvious happening or if it really was just as odd of an event as it seemed. We can't think of any explanation at all. There was no fishing wire on the shoe for them to use as a prank. I picked the shoe up and placed it back on the stand. The stand was not lopsided, it was perfectly flat. The stand was not in an area where a draft would have affected it, and there was no draft in the store anyway. The door was just open at all times, and there really wasn't any wind or airflow in or out of the store or a pressure difference. The stand, I guess, could have had a mechanism in it to launch the shoe? But it's a small stand, and I saw nothing like any separations where a part could have come out to act as a flinging mechanism. There's literally no logical explanation for this, and the more I think about it, the weirder it gets. One night with a Ouija turned me from a skeptic into a believer. Twice in my life I've used a Ouija board. The first time I did it, it didn't seem to work all that well. The board was a bit dodgy, and there was one person in the group who I was certain was moving the glass for theatrics. I couldn't prove it, but I had my doubts. The answers to the questions were sketchy at best, and not all of them made sense. The fact that our cat would sit outside the doorway and stare at where we had set it up for weeks afterward may have proved it was real. We all noted that it was kinda weird as he'd never done that before, but he eventually stopped, and we forgot about it and moved on. Perhaps we did make a connection, and our setup was just wrong, or our etiquette was off. Either way, I remained largely unconvinced that we had contacted actual spirits. The second time, though, was an entirely different outcome. A few years later, I had moved across the country to attend university. One day, I and some of my uni friends got on the topic of Ouija and decided we'd have a crack at it one night. But this time we'd do it properly. One of my friends was quite an esoteric sort of guy, and he did some research on how to properly do it. None of the others besides me had tried Ouija at this point, so we were mostly going in blind, but my friend made us a proper board setup and even used a sage smudging stick to cleanse the room of bad energies, as he put it. Once that was done, the four of us sat down and got to it. I will mention here that I was still very skeptical, so I went in with the mindset of carefully observing the other guys to see if they were messing with the glass at all, but throughout the entire session the movement was so fluid and precise that all my doubts quickly evaporated, and I was genuinely astounded that there was a supernatural entity interacting with us throughout this entire session. But that wasn't the only reason I started believing. The conversation we had with the spirit was so clear and yet so bizarre that I'll remember it forever. One thing my esoteric friend said was paramount to the experience was courtesy, so we started off basically asking if there were any spirits available to speak to us, and when we got a yes, we introduced ourselves and asked it if it wouldn't mind speaking to us for a bit, another yes. We apologized for intruding and made it clear that the spirit did not have to answer any questions it didn't want to, and then we began our questioning in earnest. I won't type out a transcript, but here's the basics. The spirit we were speaking to was a soldier, killed in 1984, and he was from Yemen. He quite enjoyed the afterlife, or wherever he was at the time. He made it very clear to us that death was not the end, and there was nothing for us to fear in the afterlife. He said the concept of heaven and hell was untrue. He also said reincarnation was possible. I then remember asking if it was a Buddhist style of reincarnation, to which we received a yes/no. I interpreted that as a sort of. After all this, we then decided amongst ourselves to wrap things up, having already had our minds blown away by what we just experienced. We said thanks to the spirit and wished it all the best. We also waited for the spirit to say goodbye to us. This was an important part, according to my friend, as it would allow the spirit to return to its own realm easily. And that was it. I walked out of that room with a strange feeling of bewilderment and yet also enormous relief. If what the spirit said was true, and I had no reason to believe it was lying to us intentionally, then death was almost something to look forward to. I considered myself a pure atheist up until this point, but this one night rattled that belief so hard that I no longer consider myself as such and will always have the memory of my Yemeni friend to prove otherwise. Thanks for listening. If anyone has any questions about my experience, feel free to ask away in the comments. There are too many experiences to count. I'm raising a young medium, so I've had many experiences. Before my daughter was born, I didn't really believe in anything paranormal. I had a couple of small experiences, but nothing like when my daughter's gifts surfaced. One experience that I love happened about 7 years ago in an apartment in Washington state. As soon as we moved in, my daughter started seeing all kinds of spirits. I found out later that a cemetery was only 2 blocks away and railroad tracks were 1 block away. Earthbound spirits, ghosts, but they don't like to be called ghosts, love to ride trains to get to places. We were having so many come to our apartment. Most were just curious. So, back to my favorite experience. My daughter kept saying that when she's playing on the floor or drawing at the table, she feels a hand on her shoulder or back. It was a comforting feeling she was getting. One night before her bedtime, she said it keeps happening, and she said it was an older grandma type lady. Very nice, and she likes to watch her draw and play. I decided to acknowledge this lady and let her know we knew she was here. I told her it's okay for her to be around and watch over my daughter. My daughter knows if a spirit is positive or not. This lady was very positive, and I had no worries. So, later that night I'm getting ready for bed. I turn off the TV and roll over on my stomach. It's hot, so I kick the down comforter off of me. It's on my lower back, near my hips. By the way, the only people home are my daughter, 6 years old, and myself. My husband was in another state working, and my son was staying with his dad in another state for the summer. I'm still very awake, and I hear footsteps next to my side of the bed approach. The footsteps sound like socks on carpet. All of a sudden, strong, firm hands scoop under my armpits and scoop me up in bed. My comforter is tossed back onto my back up to my neck. Then the comforter is pulled down a little to my shoulder. The same firm hands then proceed to tuck me in. I can feel her hands tucking the blanket under my stomach. She then pats my back twice, and I hear her walk away. I was floored. I couldn't believe that just happened. I wasn't afraid one bit but totally amazed. In the morning I asked my daughter if it was the lady who came into my room last night. She said, yes. She tucked you in. She does this for me every night. It's been years, and the lady is still with us, even when we move to different places. We love her. Her name is Addie, and she loves us like family. This happened to me when I was in 8th grade. I'm 17 now, and when I look back, it's one of the creepiest encounters I've ever had with the paranormal. It all started when my mom, who is a photography teacher at our local high school, started to organize a trip to Bodie State Historic Park. For those who are unaware, Bodie was once a sprawling mining town, known primarily for its boom in the gold industry, and it's also been known to deal with some paranormal events. Everything from dark figures seen in abandoned buildings to spirits following people home. I had an encounter with a spirit that actually followed me home. There is one rule in Bodie: you should never take anything from the town. The supposed Bodie curse, as some might call it, states that taking anything, such as a rock or even something cool you might find, a curse shall be placed on you and your family. If you don't believe me or my story, then try Googling the Bodie curse, and you'll see what I mean. Now on to my story. My mom does this thing where she usually scouts out locations beforehand to make sure they are safe, one of these places being Bodie. I knew nothing about the supposed ghost town or Bodie curse and just thought it was another boring location that my mom was dragging me to. My creepo-meter started to rise when we got onto the road leading to the town. It's right off the highway, and to get to the town, you have to drive along a dirt road that is bumpy and uncomfortable. While riding along the road, I could feel a sense of dread, like something was wrong. But I just couldn't place my finger on it. As we arrived, there was a booth that you might see at other state parks. A ranger was sitting in there, watching our car pull up. My mom explained the situation about her photo trip, and while she was doing that, I saw a sign just above the ranger's head that said, "Don't take anything from Bodie." Curious and intrigued, I read on. I saw pictures of what looked like old rusty cans and rocks, each with a story behind them. For instance, a couple takes home a rusty tin can for their antique collection, and as soon as they leave with the item, the lady's husband has a heart attack, and then their car breaks down. The lady then jogs back to the entrance of the park and puts the rusty can back where it belongs. As she returns, an ambulance is transporting her husband to the hospital, and her car, once again, amazingly starts to run again. I was in pure terror up until this point. My mom thanks the ranger, and we tread on down the road. As I look out my window, I see a bunch of old, dingy-looking brown houses, an old mine, and a cemetery. We pull into the parking lot and get out. Immediately my mom walks to the visitor's center and tells me not to wander off far. While I am walking, I get the strangest feeling to look behind me. And when I do, nothing is there. That's the whole feeling I get during my visit there. As I continue to walk, I stop to look at an old car and gas station. And as I'm doing that, the most horrible feeling of dread and sadness comes over me. I can't really explain it. It's like one moment you're happy and joyful, and the next minute you're not. I slowly walk back to the car and find my mom waiting for me. As she is rambling on about how it's the perfect location, that she can't wait to get back, I notice my face in the car window reflection. I look sorely depressed and sad. As we leave the park, all I remember is falling asleep until we got home. Nothing really freaky happened until the actual photo trip. All throughout the trip, I remember being very antisocial. If someone tried to talk to me, I would quickly push them away. Things up until this point weren't making sense. I hadn't taken anything from the park or been disrespectful in any way. Once the trip was over, we all packed up our stuff and went home. My mom, being the very focused teacher she is, stayed behind to make sure every one of her students was okay. Meanwhile, I found myself stranded in a car with strangers. As I arrived home, I immediately jumped out of the car and ran into my house. All that happened, or what I can remember that happened, is that I broke down both mentally and physically. The next upcoming week is when things in my life took a turn for the worse. My mom was rushed to the hospital for immediate surgery, and that same week I found something written on my window that I will never forget. Written on the window were the words "Help me." I'm not making this up. I tried wiping it off, but it wouldn't come off. I tried just about everything up until this point. Having had enough, I contacted my neighbor who does seances and asked if she could cleanse my house. The night of, she invited some of her friends who also know how to deal with this sort of thing. She placed some chairs in the middle of the living room and told us all to sit down. It's at this time that her friend pulls out a very realistic picture of Jesus Christ. She starts by telling everyone to close their eyes. And as we do, I can make out what appears to be a white figure, standing by some light. My neighbor tells the spirit to leave and find peace. He also instructs the spirit to leave our family alone. I watch as the white figure walks off into the light. Immediately after that happens, I feel like my old self again. My house feels more loving and welcoming, and I don't feel sad anymore. My mom goes on to make a full recovery, and nothing else of that sort ever happens again. I am warning you. If you ever do visit Bodhi, don't take anything, don't be disrespectful. Because if you do, something evil might follow you home. This is something that only my mother and I know. I haven't even told my wife. But I'm getting a bit older now, and I think it's time I shared my experience with the people I have in my life, as well as some curious individuals online. Back in 2012, I graduated from high school. Shortly after, during that summer, my mom and I moved into a new home. Rural Alabama, lots of trees and lots of peace. I actually really like living in rural areas. I don't really care too much for having a lot of people near me, and I don't very much care to have neighbors either. The first few months of living in that new home, things would get misplaced, or we'd hear the door creak open or even hear someone call your name. It was very strange, and it only got stranger in 2013. In early 2013, whenever I was alone in the home, I'd randomly pass out. Then it started turning into sleep paralysis. I'd see something, a shadow. Which I nicknamed Shadow, because it looked like a shadow of someone. It wasn't anything special. Not too tall or short, fat or skinny. Just average. No distinct features either, and Shadow always kept a distance from me. Shadow would come into my view during sleep paralysis and then leave. Then I'd regain the ability to move. First we bought carbon monoxide detectors. It was built in the 80s, I believe. No abnormal carbon monoxide. So next I saw a sleep doctor. Again nothing, my sleep was fine. I even spent a whole month at my girlfriend's place, I was fine. But my first night back home? Shadow came to visit me. But I started noticing something. Shadow would always walk in the same direction. No matter where I fell asleep and saw Shadow, Shadow would go towards a specific area of the house. This next moment, I remember in very great detail. It was Saturday, September 14, 2013. At around 9 a.m. I took the dog for a brief walk outside, and suddenly I was feeling a little sleepy. I then heard something over in the woods, and when I looked over, I saw a black figure. I was worried it was a bear, but as I stared at it longer, it was very clearly Shadow. My dog didn't take any mind to Shadow, which is weird because you'd think dogs would bark at the paranormal, right? I rushed the dog back inside, sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and stopped moving. I couldn't move again. There was Shadow, and Shadow again walked towards the same direction of the house. I had enough of this and decided to go take a look myself. I looked around the area that I thought Shadow would go to, and there was nothing. I wouldn't see Shadow again for the next few days, same events as usual. Then on October 7th, Monday evening, I was parking the car and decided that maybe I didn't check the right part of the house. The house had a cellar, but we never went in. I remember my mom said she saw a giant snake skin and was too afraid to go any deeper than the door area. So of course I wrapped myself up in extra layers of clothing, despite it being nearly 70 to 80 degree temps and high humidity, because I didn't want to get bitten by a snake. I grabbed a flashlight and checked out the cellar. The cellar was made entirely of bricks, whitish gray in color. Lots of dirt, there was no floor. I am very confident that they didn't follow building codes, but it was rural Alabama after all. At least there were floor joists for the main house, ha. It was a very painful walk, by the way, you had to be slightly crouched through the entire cellar. Well, what did I find? Lots of canned food, wouldn't eat it at this point, obviously. Saw the giant snake skin my mom talked about. No snakes, thankfully. Some cabinets, dressers, and a small area that looked like a room inside of the cellar. I mean, of course the cellar was full of rooms, but this one was a bit smaller looking. Doing some detective work, I quickly realized this was the area Shadow would walk to in the house, so maybe Shadow was telling me to check out this room? So I slowly went over there, peeked in slowly, and nothing important at first glance. It looked like someone was using it as storage. There were boxes. I think 5 or 6 small to medium-sized boxes. I took them all out of the cellar and went through them. Lots of random decorative items, some toys, clothes, and of course some books. Mostly just random things, a dictionary, a biology book. But one thing did stick out that was different. There was a journal. Well, more precisely, it was a diary from 1985. Lots of teenage drama in it, parents mad that the teen snuck out of the house and went to Huntsville, Al, with friends to go see Kiss perform. There was some funny stuff in the diary. But what really took me by surprise was how the diary ended. At the end, the diary mentioned that Mom had passed away a few months ago and that they were finally moving out. That was it. When I went back inside, I asked out loud to Shadow if they used to live here and had a daughter that was rebellious and wanted to go see Kiss. I waited for sleep paralysis to kick in. Waited about an hour, then I realized nothing was going to happen. Nothing happened the rest of that year. March 7, 2014, I got home late. It was a bad day, I and my at the time girlfriend broke up. I was struggling in college and was debating dropping out, which I did stop going for a while. But that Friday night, I would see Shadow for the very last time. I crashed on the couch, heard a noise, and then sleep paralysis kicked in. I saw Shadow over at the dining area. I watched Shadow walk over to the dresser of random items we put in, and the dresser opened up. Shadow walked away, and I was able to move again. Of course, what was the first time there? The diary. I decided I would reunite the diary and this person, so I looked her up on Facebook. I found her Facebook, she passed away in 2009. I got in contact with her son and said that I found her diary from her teenage years. We met up, and he told me the things I found belonged to his mom. She passed away in the house we were living in, she had a brain aneurysm. He asked if he could have them, of course, I said yes. After that, I went home. I never passed out again or ever had sleep paralysis. I never saw Shadow ever again. Things stopped being misplaced, no more doors opening and closing, no more whispers or hearing our names being called. That was it. This person lived in the house as a teenager, her mom died, and they moved out. She bought the house and lived in it with her husband and son until she passed away. I do not know if Shadow was the owner of the diary or if Shadow was the mom trying to have her daughter's belongings returned to her son. Funny how there is still a mystery to this story, isn't it? But that was my paranormal experience, and here we are in 2024. I've never had a paranormal experience ever since. No ghosts, no shadows, no orbs, nothing I couldn't explain. I don't live there anymore, neither does my mom. She never saw Shadow, but she did experience her own fair share of strange things in that house up until Shadow went away. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I sometimes think back to these experiences, and it fills me with hope about the future and what we will experience after this life is gone. What we believe was our daughter's paranormal moment as a toddler. From the time our daughter was just about a year to just over 2 years old, we'd periodically get woken up to the sounds of her giggling to flat-out cackling and squealing in excitement. When either of us would get up to see what the fuss was about, she'd be standing or sitting at any of the 3 sides of her crib, looking up. One day I was holding her and walking from each framed photo of family members. I'd point to those in the pics and say, "Who's that?" I pointed to her mom, myself, my mom, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my brother, and his wife. Each time she'd say her word for that person. There was a collage with a number of people, memories of the past my wife and I made and framed. There were family and friends who were no longer with us / passed on, including my father, who'd passed away a decade before our daughter was born. I started pointing at people, and if she didn't know them, she'd look at me real fast and hold the palms of her hands up like, I don't know. So I'd point to the person again and say their name. She'd do her best to repeat it. In the collage was a pic of my late father and me. I pointed to me. She said, Dada. I pointed to my father, and she got all excited. She started bending her knees in my arms, raising up and down, giggling with the biggest smile. She raised her arms up in the air and looked at the ceiling and said loudly, Papa. Papa. She kept giggling and saying, Papa. I had chills, and my wife was looking at us with wide eyes. I started to tear up. For one, no one had ever shown her a photo of my father. We didn't have one hanging up in the rooms where she frequented. No reason. We just didn't have very many big photos of him. For two, she'd never said the word before. Not ever. Lastly, my brother lives halfway across the country, and at that time he had only seen my daughter once. He has one daughter, but she was in college when we visited him, so she'd never met our daughter. But my niece spent a lot of her early life around my late father before my brother relocated. Papa was what my niece called my father, and he loved being called Papa. Her reaction had my wife and me thinking and admittedly hoping that maybe, just maybe, all those times we had woken up to our daughter giggling / laughing and squealing in delight, it was my late father paying her a visit. Let me preface by saying this happened around 10 years ago. Also, I've always been very skeptical of paranormal stuff, and I'm not at all superstitious, but one encounter will always stick with me. I grew up with my grandparents in a quiet suburb outside Washington, D.C., and our house was only a few hundred yards from a large park called Sleepy Hollow Woods. I used to always play in the woods as a child, alone or with friends, and never had any issues. I loved the outdoors and explored the woods thoroughly. However, I would never stay out after dark, of course. My mother grew up here as well and would always tell stories about the woods and believed they were haunted. She said plenty of creepy things happen with her. For instance, when she was younger, they had 2 family labs. They were super friendly, and my mother and uncles would walk them through the woods all the time. One time, my mother was walking alone with the dogs around dusk when she came across what she describes as a ripped-off deer haunch lying covered in blood in the middle of a trail. There were no other deer parts or body or blood anywhere to be seen, just this random, bloody leg. She described it as having the appearance of being ripped off, definitely not cut. Obviously freaked out, she took the dogs and just started heading home. All of a sudden, near the exit of the park, the dogs completely froze in their tracks and just started growling into the tree line. This was very unlike them, as they were super friendly with both people and other animals and were quite large and never feared anything. However, as my mother kept trying to pull them along and see what they were growling about, their tails went between their legs, and they started whimpering, refusing to move forward. It was then my mom said she saw a large, almost 8-foot dark figure with glowing red eyes move between the trees, staring right at her. She immediately turned around with the dogs and fled, taking a different exit out of the woods. My uncle has also said he's seen the red-eyed giant before, but never a clear view, always a silhouette. Keep in mind there are no bears or anything of the sort around here that could / would do that to a deer. On another occasion some years later, my mom recalled walking with our old golden retriever near the woods. Again, the retriever was the sweetest dog in the world and loved everybody. But my mom came across an old, creepy lady feeding and talking quietly to some wild rabbits on one of the sidewalks / trails. Immediately our dog started growling at the woman, something my mother has never heard her do before. My mom immediately apologized to the lady and walked around her with her dog, tugging her along. As she continued to walk, she came across a circle of rabbits all standing perfectly still and just staring at her. My mom promptly ran home. My mother and uncles have other stories, but I always thought they were full of shit, either just imagining things or making them up to scare me, since I've played in those woods so many times and never had any issues. However, my older brother used to go on nightly walks through the woods, and he told me he's seen the red-eyed monster and other mysterious creepy encounters. I was around 15 or 16 at the time and loved ghost stories and had never encountered anything like that, so I was able to convince him to go out ghost hunting with me. Of course, I thought it was all a bunch of silly bullshit anyway. The first time we went out, we had a few friends over. We were hanging out late at night, smoking weed and telling ghost stories. Of course, we mentioned the haunted forest. We were living in a house down the street from our grandparents at the time, so still practically next door to the woods. My friends all thought it'd be fun if we went out into the forest to search for some ghosts and monsters and have a good laugh. We waited until it was about 2 to 2:30 a.m. and headed out. There was a fairly large group of us, maybe 6 to 8 people total, including my brother and myself. As we're walking through this pitch black forest using our phones as flashlights, I kid you not, all phones turned off at the same time. Of course the girls in our group started freaking out, and to be honest, I'm pretty sure we all did, but we were also kind of laughing at the nonsense of it all. There was no noise anywhere other than us, the forest was completely dead silent, and after a few minutes everyone was able to get their phones turned on and working again. We decided to head home at that point. Could have been a freak accident, I'm not really sure. The second time I went with my brother and a couple of other friends, this time a much smaller crew, I think maybe 3 or 4 of us all together. Same as before, we'd thought it'd be fun and silly to go out ghost hunting at night and see my brother's little Sasquatch friend. This time was different, however. The moment we entered the forest, things got weird. The forest felt unnaturally dark, and our lights barely reached the tree line on either side. We brought flashlights this time. We also immediately felt a large sense of dread, danger, and adrenaline, and like we were being watched from all sides. Quite frankly, it was terrifying, as only moments before we were joking and laughing and telling ghost stories, but we all immediately shut up and felt it not even 30 yards from the road/entrance to the forest. Whatever, we continued slowly walking deeper into the woods, talking and nervously laughing as we peered about with our flashlights. The forest was dead silent when suddenly, all at once, we heard what sounded like what can only be described as several thousand monkeys screaming and screeching at us from the treetops and tree lines in all directions, all around us. The noise was overwhelmingly loud and deafening. I've never heard anything like it, or since. It's hard to describe, but angry, hateful monkeys all crying out in anger at us is the best way to describe it. And those cries were definitely targeted at us. The sense of danger and dread immediately jumped to 11, and we wasted no time in turning tail and sprinting for the forest exit, the sounds of 1,000 lost souls screaming incredibly loud chasing us from above and around. Obviously, we saw no animals or anything in the trees or around us when flashing our lights up and about, but we're also more preoccupied with getting the duck out of there. Like I said, we were only perhaps a few hundred feet from the entrance of the forest, so it took no time at all to get out. The moment we stepped out of the forest and into the light of a nearby street lamp, the forest fell dead quiet. Not a rustle, not a whisper. For those of you wondering, there are not any ducking wild monkeys in these woods lol. Nor anything else I could think of that would make those sounds. But that shit was loud. And obviously terrifying. The third, and final, time I worked up the courage to go ghost hunting and find these evil little monkey shits once and for all, sealed the deal with me. I will never forget what happened on that night. A few months, or perhaps a year or so, after our encounter with the angry monkeys, I was still upset that I had never encountered the red-eyed Sasquatch thing, and I convinced myself that the prior experience was probably just some rabid foxes or something. It wasn't. My older brother agreed to go out into the woods one last time with me, as he didn't really fear anything, and to be honest, neither did I. I was some edgy-ass 15 or 16-year-old anyway. This time if I heard them yelling at me, I was just going to yell at them back and demand they show themselves. Or something, I don't know, I just wanted to prove to myself that night really happened, and I wasn't just crazy. The setting was perfect, a full moon, and it was about to hit 2 a.m. My brother brought a couple of knives and throwing knives, and I brought a large quarterstaff. I had black belt training in bow staff from my childhood. We set out on our little adventure. From the very start, things were different from our previous encounter for the better. There were no unnatural feelings of being watched, no sense of fear or dread, no sense of panic. We walked all through the woods, sticking to the major paths. The occasional cricket chirp and the sounds of the nearby creek flowing downriver were the only noises we heard. At one point, a bush I was walking past bristled and something fled away, causing me to almost piss myself, but I figured it was probably a raccoon or fox or something that we had spooked. After about an hour of pointlessly walking around, we decided to pack it in. As we started heading back home, my brother would occasionally stop in the path and begin listening intensely. For what, I didn't know, as I heard nothing around us. He just said he thought he heard something. A few minutes later he stopped and grabbed my arm tightly. I looked up at him and asked what the big idea was, as we were almost out of the forest and I just wanted to get home at this point. He quickly hushed me and told me to shut the duck up, so I did. Then he whispered that someone was following us, though he never once turned around or anything. At that precise moment I caught the worst goosebumps of my life and felt the presence staring at us from behind. I very slowly began to turn and look behind us. As I did, I saw a shadow or silhouette, literally creeping up behind us. The best way to describe what I saw was a large, 8+ feet figure with glowing red eyes, silently walking down the path toward us. Once it saw that I had seen it, it immediately crouched low and dashed straight out of the path and into the tree line, at a full sprint but without making a noise, and straight at us. I remember just yelling at my brother, "Run!" And we ducking ran. The thing is, this ducker started chasing us. I had never felt more danger, more raw hatred emanating from someone or something before. I knew it was going to kill us. And we were sprinting for our very lives through this maze of a forest. And it chased us the entire way, just barely behind us. It must have been going fast to keep up because we were booking it. I never turned around, nor did my brother, for that would have slowed us down even a tiny bit, but we didn't have to as we sensed it closing in. I could feel it reaching out to grab me by my neck/collar, just inches keeping myself from it as I ran for dear life. At this point we could also hear it clearly kicking up the gravel and dirt just inches behind us. Knowing there was no way we'd make it to the proper exit in time, I yelled at my brother to follow me off the main path and through a small hidden trail that I knew from my young childhood. Gloriously we burst out of the forest and into the lighted lawn of what used to be my best friend's backyard. As soon as we got out of the forest and into the lights of the yard, we immediately stopped and turned to face our attacker. But it just stood there, just out of light and in the tree line, menacingly glaring at us with hatred and animosity. I never got a good view of it, not like I had when I first saw it on the trail creeping up on us, but I could sense it was there and almost barely see a large, almost 8-foot figure/shadow moving amongst the tree line staring us down. Full of adrenaline, I yelled at it to come out into the light and fight, instead of creeping like a pussy cat. I had my staff out in front of me, and my brother had a knife in each hand, and we were prepared to defend ourselves. "Duck this guy." Suddenly something hit me in the chest. Stunned, I looked down to see a few pieces of gravel from the main path we were on earlier standing at my feet. It threw it at me. My brother saw it too and immediately threw one of his knives into the forest from where the rocks came, and we turned and ran home. We've never been back in those woods since, and we will never be caught in them past dusk if I ever go at all. I don't know if it was an angry hobo or something living out in the woods or what, but from memory, the best I can describe what I saw was a very large man figure, walking/creeping quietly up on us, and once it saw that I had noticed it, it hunched down low and sprinted silently into the tree line straight for us. I have never felt such danger or hatred in my entire life. I know for a fact that whoever or whatever it was, it meant to do us great harm. I've since heard stories of crawlers and other such things, and perhaps this was an example of one, I don't know. But my brother swears on his life that he didn't set that up to scare us or have anything to do with what happened, and that he was just as terrified as I was at the time. Oh, and he never did find his throwing knife. The dumbass actually went back to look for it in the morning. Unfortunately, my brother never got to see it. He said he heard and sensed it following us, but he never got a view of the ducker. Anyway, I don't know what the deal is with that forest, but I highly recommend everyone stay far, long away from it at night. And yeah, for a skeptic, I can agree that it's unlikely that it was a person. In fact, I'm certain it wasn't. I've always thought of it and referred to it simply as the creeper. And yes, it did have the glowing red eyes. What do you guys think it could have been? Have any of you had similar encounters? Let me know in the comments, and I'll try to answer any questions as well. Well, that's the story of Sleepy Hollow Woods. I know, hell of a name for a forest. At least I can clear my mom and uncle's name in terms of their sanity and seeing shit in the woods. I never believed it all until I had my experience at an old hotel in New Orleans. At that time, it was called the Ambassador Hotel. Here's what happened. About 15 years ago, I was in New Orleans for work for a total of 4 nights. I chose this hotel because it was near the convention center where I needed to be, and it was in my company's price range. It was described as a boutique hotel. I later found out it used to be an old warehouse that was renovated. So my room had the original wooden beams, etc. Anyway, when I first entered the room, the TV was on, and the doors of the armoire where the TV was held were wide open. I found that odd because in order to walk to the bathroom, you would have to have those doors closed because the armoire was at the foot of the bed. Anyway, I turned off the TV and closed the doors and started doing a little work at the desk. Suddenly, my room became ice cold. I went over to the thermostat, and it's one of those old-fashioned ones where you slide to the left for cold, the middle position is off, and to the right was heat. The thermostat was slid all the way to the left on cold, so I adjusted it to heat and then left the room to go to the convention center for a few hours. When I came back, the room was once again cold, and the TV was on. When I checked the thermostat, it was slid back all the way to cold. This freaked me out a bit because someone obviously had to be in there, but my mind did not go to ghosts yet. I checked the whole room, and no one was in there, the door locked correctly, so I put it out of my head. That night in the middle of the night the TV went on while I was sleeping. It was really starting to annoy me. Over the next 3 days I was gone at the convention center, but upon returning I continued to have the experience of the room going cold and the TV going on in my presence. There simply was no explanation of how the thermostat could slide to the far left while I was in the room. So on my last evening there, I was really freaking out, but I had a very early morning flight, so I needed to be awake at 4 a.m. At around midnight, my TV went on, and I did something you should never do. I said out loud, "All right, ghost, if you're really in here and you want to mess with me, then mess with me." At that moment, my bed started shaking. Not a little bit, it was literally violently shaking. I jumped out of bed and called downstairs. Explaining what was happening, the person at the desk jokingly said, "You must be in the haunted room." I told them I was serious, and is anyone else reporting anything like this? He said that a guest reported the same experience a couple of weeks prior, but he didn't know if that was the same room or not. He kind of calmed me down and offered to switch me to a new room, but I didn't want to pack up all of my belongings just for 4 hours of sleep. Plus, I thought I was going crazy. As we ended our phone call, the bed stopped shaking, and all was quiet in the room. I lay back down under the covers, pulled tight up to my neck, and lay there very quietly, and something grabbed the blankets at the foot of my bed, where my feet were, and yanked 3 hard times. And that was the last thing that happened. So, about 2 years later, I needed to go back to the same convention center and thought I had to have been going crazy, or there had to be a reasonable explanation, and I booked the same hotel and had no experiences. When I checked out on my last day, I asked the gentleman at the front desk if I could ask him a strange question. So I asked him if he thought the hotel could be haunted, and he laughed and said, "I don't think it could be, I know it is." He then asked if I had a ghost experience, so I told him not on this trip but gave him details of my previous trip. He said that side of the hotel is the haunted side, and that employees will never go to that side of the hotel alone at night, and then he shared with me things that have happened to their staff while on that side of the building. This made me a believer in ghosts without a doubt. Since then, I've had a few things that are not understandable, but nothing as severe as what I experienced in New Orleans. True encounters with a demon. I used to be a skeptic when it came to things of the paranormal. However, having lived through some pretty horrific experiences myself, I am now a true believer. What I am about to share with you are some real events and not fictional in the least. This is why I mention no names. I want to protect those who have been affected by all this and their privacy. I get chills just recounting these encounters. To preface, I am a 45-year-old gay male. My demonic encounter started when I moved into my first apartment in the summer of 1992. I was 20 at the time. Unfortunately, my demonic encounter lasted for nearly 8 years before I could finally get rid of it for good. Here are the most terrifying events that happened over that 8-year period. Now on to my story. I had moved to Casper, Wyoming, a town about 55 miles from where I graduated from high school that year. A friend of mine turned me onto a cute 2-bedroom apartment on Elm Street. Yes, I did say Elm Street, folks. The apartment was on the basement floor of a 2-story house that has been converted into 2 apartments. My friend had recently moved into the main floor apartment and suggested my then boyfriend at the time and I take the bottom unit. It was an ideal situation since we all worked at the same mall at the time. It was mid-June, and there was no air conditioning in the apartment at the time, so as you can well imagine, it was pretty flipping hot in that apartment. I was in the middle of painting the master bedroom when I decided to take a break from the fumes and the heat and headed to the kitchen to get a tall glass of iced tea and have a quick smoke. Now keep in mind I was the only one in the apartment at the time, as my boyfriend was working. If I recall, it was around 11 p.m., and he was not due home until after 1 a.m. or around there. After finishing my smoke, I headed back to the bedroom to finish painting. As I walked back into the room, every hair on my entire body stood on end. My heart began to beat out of my chest as I realized there was something painted on the opposite wall of where I had been painting. There was no paint spilled on the carpet, and the brush I had been using was right where I left it. Heart still pounding, I slowly crept up to the wall. The paint was still wet and slowly dripping down the wall. I gasped in horror as I read what was painted on the wall. It simply read, "I am here." I bolted the duck out of there and waited outside on the stoop until my boyfriend came home from. I was not about to go back to the apartment again by myself. My boyfriend, being a skeptic, dismissed it as maybe I had done it myself without remembering or that the upstairs neighbor had snuck in and painted it, even though they were not home at the time the occurrence had happened. Fast forward a few months, we had been gone all day, and it was late when we got home. Having an early day the next day, I headed for the shower while he grabbed himself a beer. As I was showering, I heard the door to the bathroom open and close. I remember smiling to myself, thinking he was going to join me in the shower for some playtime. I was in the middle of rinsing the conditioner out of my hair when I heard the shower curtain slide open. "Decided you wanted a quickie before bed, eh?" I asked, still rinsing my hair. "Sounds good to me," said a voice that was not my boyfriend's. The voice sounded gravelly and low. About that time I felt ice-cold hands grab my shoulders from behind. I spun around in horror only to discover I was in the shower alone. I exited the bathroom in such haste I did not even bother to grab a towel. Heart pounding and dripping wet, I was now in the front room panting and trying to catch my breath. My boyfriend shaking uncontrollably and pointing to the bathroom. His eyes were fixed, and he appeared to be in a state of shock. His voice quivering, he whispered, "I saw it go in there." Fast forward 2 years. We had just moved into another basement apartment. This one was on the other side of town. It too was a house that has been transformed into 2 separate units. The owner of the house and his boyfriend lived upstairs and were offered a killer deal as far as rent. I think we were paying $200,000 a month for the 2-bedroom apartment. We had only lived there about 2 months before the demonic activity started up again. There were old-fashioned swinging doors, like you would find in those old Western movies, that separated the front room and the kitchen. We had lived in the new place about 2 months, and there was no supernatural activity of any kind. We were thinking maybe the entity had not followed us to our new home and had begun to truly relax. We were dead wrong. We were settling down to sleep when the saloon doors between the kitchen and living room began to swing back and forth with a vengeance. The night lights in the kitchen and our bedroom went out, leaving us completely in the dark. "Come play with me," a demonic voice called out to my boyfriend from the kitchen. It was so loud it echoed through the entire apartment. Still shrouded in complete darkness, he and both shook uncontrollably under the covers. We began to quietly argue over who was going to make a break for the light switch located on the wall by the door. Not knowing what else to do, I yelled for it to leave in Jesus' name. The entity roared so loudly I swear you could feel the house shake. We could hear the saloon doors fly open, the night lights came back on, and we were alone again, for how long we didn't know. It took us about 20 minutes before we could muster up enough courage to move. Needless to say, we did not get any sleep that night and had every light in the place on. Fast forward another couple of weeks. Our company for the evening had just left, and my boyfriend and I had settled in our recliners in the front room to watch a movie and chill for the remainder of the evening. A loud knock on the front door signaling one of our friends had probably forgotten their car keys or something caused my boyfriend to pause the movie and head to the door. He stopped short and shot me a concerned look. Puzzled, I asked him if he was going to get the door or not. He pointed out the motion-censored light was not on. Opening the door, he visibly shivered as there was nobody there and no vehicles in the drive but our own. As he shut the door, there came a loud crash and the sound of glass breaking from the kitchen. Walking into the kitchen, it took me a minute to figure out what had happened. The coffee pot that was tucked into the corner by the sink was now lying in a zillion pieces under the dining room table. The knocking started up again on the front door. Again, no light to indicate somebody was actually there. Then the knocking switched to the back door. Actually, it was more like pounding. The pounding was hard and loud. I was sure the door was going to cave in. The air became thick and heavy, so much so that it was hard to breathe. That was enough for us that night. My boyfriend and I bolted out of the house and spent the remainder of the night at a local Denny's restaurant drinking coffee, too terrified to return to the house until morning. Now fast forward another couple of years. By this time we had found a beautiful 2-story home to rent. We loved it because there was a spiral staircase between the 2 floors. The front door led you to the main floor of the home where the kitchen, dining room, and living room were. The back door leads you into the basement where the bedrooms and bathroom were located. It was a way cute little house, and we loved it. That is until the entity found us again. I say this because after each move, it seemed it took it a while to either find us or decide to show it had anyway. I would usually dream that I was standing in a large room with doors all around it. In the dream, all the doors would all start slamming shut one at a time as I ran from door to door trying to escape. As the last one slammed shut, the room would fill with demonic laughter, which is how I knew it had found us again. The night after having this dream, my husband and I were downstairs in our bedroom putting our laundry away when we heard my mother hollering down to us from the top of the stairs for us to come up and visit with her. We shot one another a confused look because my mother lived about 55 miles away and never came over without calling first. That and both the front and back doors were locked. Thinking maybe my mom had made a copy of our house key, and of course not wanting to be rude, I headed upstairs to visit with my boyfriend hot on my heels. As I approached the top of the stairs, I could see the front door was still locked and there was no sign of my mom anywhere. The temperature in the living room had dropped drastically, causing me to shiver. As I moved into the living room, my boyfriend walked to the front door, opened it, and confirmed that there was no car in the driveway. That is when we both saw a large black mass make its way slowly across the wall from the kitchen into the dining room. Its slow movement appeared to be deliberate, as if it wanted us to see it. As it moved through the dining room into the front room, my mother's picture flew off the wall, past me, and went straight down into the basement. As the years progressed, so did the entity's activities. It had gotten so bad that even our friends and family refused to come over. They too would see the black mass, witness things moving on their own, and hear disembodied voices calling their names. One morning I had just arrived home from a 13-hour night shift and had settled on the couch to watch some television before heading to bed. Out of nowhere, there was a huge boom. It sounded like a bomb had gone off. The whole house, and I do mean the whole house, began to shake violently. It only lasted about 10 seconds or so, I am not sure because it felt much longer than that. I quickly ran outdoors, thinking maybe a gas main in the neighborhood had exploded or maybe we had an earthquake. All was calm and still, no one else seemed to even be aware that something major had just happened. As I was on the phone with the police department reporting what had just happened, my boyfriend and my brother, who had stayed the night in our guest room, came tearing upstairs in a panic. Their faces were pale white, and you could see they were truly terrified. The police assured me that nobody else had reported anything and that maybe it was just my house settling. My brother said the house shook so violently it shook him right out of bed onto the floor. I knew then that it was the demon, and it was time to try to rid ourselves of it once and for all. I had several ministers, priests, and mediums come to my house. The mediums were at least more helpful. The religious men were too afraid to do anything at all and simply said, "Pray," and left. I finally found a minister who specialized in the deliverance ministry. She was well versed in dealing with demonic activity and getting rid of it. She was able to ascertain the demon's name, which gave her power over it, or Jesus, whatever. She told me it was not her exorcising the demon but rather the power and the blood of Jesus. I also learned that the demon was not actually attached to me but rather my boyfriend. I learned the reason it always took the demon a while to show back up was that the cleansing rituals I had been doing were working to a point, but my boyfriend was the one that kept opening up the door, so to speak, for it to return. I was not aware of it at the time, but he had not only been dabbling with witchcraft, but he was meeting strangers in the graveyard for sex since the cops heavily patrolled the city parks. They were once a hot spot for random hookups and drug use. Needless to say, I was able to finally rid myself of the demon and my boyfriend. Unfortunately for him, the demon followed him, and his life quickly fell apart. He got into drugs, alcohol, and worse. He passed away last year unexpectedly. We remained friends over the years and would talk on the phone or text. I spoke to him a week before his death, and he had told me he was still being tormented by the demon. I have no idea what actually happened to my ex. It has always been kind of kept hush-hush. I just pray that he is at peace now. Personally, I don't find the harsh binary dichotomy between skeptic and believer to be particularly useful in the broader quest to actually experience, learn, and understand more of the world we live in. It's incredibly dangerous to identify oneself as an uncritical believer. I mean, historically this has been nothing but a source of grief, and a hardcore skeptic who isn't actually interested in investigating these phenomena in good faith, or at least giving some thought and consideration, is ultimately just an uncritical believer with a different belief system. Personally, I would still class myself as someone who leans closer to the skeptical side of things in the classical sense. Which is to say that I try to approach things analytically and systematically, at least when it comes specifically to reported paranormal events, and very strongly prefer to rule out pretty much all of the more mundane possibilities before jumping to any far-flung conclusions. That having been said, not only do I want to believe certain things, but I feel that I have no choice but to believe them. I do not believe that I know exactly what is happening or why. Most of those kinds of assessments are made through the lens of a specific religious, spiritual, or personal schema, and while there is nothing wrong with that, it's impossible to verify those interpretations one way or another. I don't know, for example, if a poltergeist is a result of a wayward earthbound spirit, a subconscious psychokinetic manifestation of a human's internal energetic potential, literal magic, a dimensional bleed, a wrinkle in the code of reality, some as yet unclassified electromagnetic entity, or some combination of the above. I do know that, while most cases involving the Warrens were probably just them fishing for another book and movie deal, there are still a lot of interesting, credible, and compelling instances of poltergeist activity, including a few instances that I experienced myself and one major ongoing instance that was experienced by multiple members of my family who have no specific motive for lying to either themselves, each other, or unaffected parties, that cannot be easily explained by carbon monoxide, ergot poisoning, or the profit motive. So I do believe that something can happen, within the broader context of our physical and/or metaphysical reality, that we refer to as a poltergeist, and that it can happen in a variety of different ways and contexts, and that it has certain persistent identifying features. I don't believe that I know what exactly happens, but I do believe that it does, sometimes, happen. I also feel that if we want to have any chance of understanding even a tiny fraction of the wonders of the cosmos, we do need to be skeptical in our approach to any individual case. This is useful mainly so that we can more easily separate actual manifestations or anomalies from mistaken or falsified ones, not so that we can completely invalidate the very existence of legitimate occurrences. When legitimate occurrences are buried deep in a pile of common hallucinations, false memories, hoaxes, and urban legends, we have a harder time actually finding our way to any semblance of the truth, and while we may never know the big, absolute truth, I do believe we can pursue it and get rewarded with a lot of smaller truths for our efforts. I think I'm being haunted by a shadow man, and it's starting to get bad. Ever since I was little, I've seemed to have a special sense for the paranormal. I would constantly see or hear things others didn't and had so many imaginary friends that seemed so real to me at the time that I often question now if they were something more than imaginary. I had one thing that I'd always see that I know for a fact is not imaginary, though. I can only describe it as a plain black shadow figure. It's very tall, maybe about 6 feet minus 5 feet, and it seems to be wearing a suit with a top hat on its head. I started seeing this figure around the age of 6. It started off as very brief encounters. I would occasionally see him out of the corner of my eye or creepily watching me from other rooms. I simply brushed it off at the time because, well, I was 6 and didn't think anything of it. But as I got older, it seemed to grow stronger. It began turning off lights, turning the sink on and off, stealing things, and moving objects and furniture around. I know it was he who did it because I would always see a glimpse of him before or after the event occurred. It also weirdly would happen whenever no one else was around. So eventually when I'd bring it up to my parents, they wouldn't believe me. The only things they did notice were the toys that had simply vanished from me. Of course they just blamed it on me being young and not being responsible with my stuff. These events continued on throughout my childhood. I pretty much had just accepted the fact that this thing was now a part of my life and I was just going to have to deal with it. I will admit, though, I did feel like maybe I was going crazy because it didn't matter where I was or what time it was, it always seemed to be there, watching. Now skip forward to about a year ago. I was talking with one of my brothers at the kitchen table. I had brought up the idea of getting a Ouija board to see if all the stories people told of it were real. My brother wasn't completely on board with that idea, but me being me, I convinced him otherwise and bought the cheapest board I could find. It ended up being like $20. Now I won't lie, I was excited to use the board. I definitely believed in it, but I didn't believe it was capable of releasing any evil. My hope was that with the board, I could somehow communicate with the shadow man that had been with me all these years, but I was fine with communicating with just about anything in all reality. I've since had many experiences with that board, most of which were horrifying events I will remember for the rest of my life, some of which still affect me today. Those are totally different stories for another time. But I firmly believe that this one specific time is what truly made this shadow man gain the most power. It was a summer day, and I decided I wanted to play the board again. I asked my brother if he'd play it with me because I knew I wasn't supposed to play alone. Of course, though he said no, so I decided to screw it and just play by myself. I brought the board to the basement, which is where I'd usually set it up. I put up 4 white candles and unboxed the board. I then lit all 4 candles and turned off the lights before beginning. I wasn't expecting much to happen because I was by myself and didn't think I'd have enough energy, but man was I wrong. It didn't take long before the board responded to me by aggressively moving the planchette to yes when I asked if anything was there. I politely then asked what their name was, and it responded with, "You already know me." Confused, I continued to question whatever it was, thinking maybe it was a relative who had passed, but then it clicked. All the answers made sense. It was the shadow man. After all these years he had decided to finally talk to me. I asked if it was him to confirm my suspicions, in which he replied with a strong yes. I began to feel the energy in the room change. Everything got cold, and goosebumps ran up my arm. I got this gut-wrenching feeling of dread and fear. It no longer felt like I was alone. I looked up in front of me, and to my horror, there the shadow man was, but closer to me. Closer than he's ever gotten to me. If I really wanted to, I could have reached out and touched him. Horrified, I quickly tried moving the planchette to goodbye, only to be met by a strong force pushing it back. I pushed with all my strength, trying to move the planchette to goodbye, but it had continuously moved back with forceful pushes that were strong enough to shove the planchette off the board. I was trying not to let them know I was afraid. For one of the first times, this entity that had been following me for most of my life, that I had become so used to over the years, made me fearful of my life. I was certain at this point I was going to be killed by a ghost right here, right now, and my grave marker was going to be plastered with "Here lies blank, cause of death, Ouija board." No, but really, I was shitting bricks. I eventually, out of desperation, took my hands off the planchette, picked it up, and slammed it to say goodbye. Now I know what you're thinking. You just made the situation 10x worse by breaking one of the rules of the board and removing your hands, but at the time it seemed like the best option as nothing else was working. After saying goodbye, I blew the candles out and started quickly putting away the board. That's when I felt it, burning on my back and arms. I tried to ignore it as I just wanted to clean up and get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't do that, it burned too much. So I ran to the bathroom and faced myself in the mirror only to be met with scratches in rows of 3 running up my arms and back. The scratches on my arms were so severe that they drew blood. Unfortunately, that's not the most disturbing thing I saw. I guess I was so obsessed with my obvious scratches that when I finally took a real glance in the mirror, he was there. The shadow man himself was there, standing, staring back at my reflection in the mirror, looking as if he was about to grab me. That's when I booked it. I had finally gotten the bright idea to run out my basement door screaming bloody murder, probably looking like a complete wacko in the process. I refused to go back into the house until way after dark when it began to rain and was forced in. It was only when I showed my parents the scratches and mess downstairs that they somewhat started to believe me, but not completely. To put it into shorts, I was a mess and had to spend the next few weeks with band-aids on my arms. Things got the worst they had ever been in my life. The shadow man remained physical, and over the next few months I would wake up with bruises and scratches on my body. My dog, which used to sleep in my room, would wake up to bark/growl at what appeared to be nothing in the middle of the night. I constantly woke up feeling like something was on top of me, choking me out. Then sometimes in the morning there'd be marks in the shape of handprints around my neck. It always seemed to be the worst when I was alone, though. Once I was home alone and was pushed from the top of my stairs. I ended up escaping with painful but minor injuries. My parents believe me somewhat right now, but still not completely, even after being shown proof, so I'm practically alone in this. I tried cleansing the house and me, but it only seemed to make it mad. I even reached out to a friend whose dad was a priest to get holy water to cleanse the house further with. It didn't work, though. I even tried getting rid of the board by throwing it in the trash only for it to return back to me not once but multiple times. No matter what I did, I could not get rid of the board or this evil shadow man. And that leads me to today. I still lie in the same house and still have the board I used that day. I've tried multiple things, all of which haven't worked, so I'm open to just about anything anyone suggests. The physical and emotional abuse by this entity still continues, maybe not as often, but it always happens eventually, almost as a reminder he's still there. Let this stand as a reminder to never screw with the paranormal. It's real and not to be messed with. I'm a 30-year-old from Australia, and the events began to take place when I was about 15 years old. My older brother, who was 18, was dating a girl named Casey, and I, my brother, and her were alone in the house watching a movie. It was one of the first times meeting her. We had a normal night, nothing strange happened. When I randomly heard a loud female scream in my mind, I was aware it was on my mind but had never experienced this before, and it was strange. I looked around the room at my brother and his girlfriend with a worried look, and she then said, "Can you hear it too?" I said, "I just heard a girl scream, did you hear that?" My brother said no, and she said it was a lost spirit who died. She's scared and lost. I was a pretty normal kid, I didn't think about much deep before this. I played rugby, hung out with friends, and did normal stuff. When she said that, it scared me a lot. She then spent the next few hours explaining that she has dealt with this for years and that now that I have heard this voice, it would get much more intense and that I am a powerful old soul. She said she was into witchcraft and speaking to spirits and that she would always protect me and not to be afraid. We eventually went to sleep, and the next day I woke up remembering just not being able to stop thinking about what happened. A week or so later, I, my brother, and Casey were in his room hanging out when she went into a seizure state, shaking uncontrollably and speaking in gibberish. My brother was very concerned, but I was very calm. She told me to put my hand on her and help her. I placed my hand on her leg, and she stopped shaking and started breathing deeply, saying she was feeling something in the room that was reacting to me being there. Not much else happened that night, but I did start to feel the presence of this entity in the room. It's important to add that the room my brother was in was a garage we converted to a granny flat for my grandfather, who passed away in this room 2 years prior. Over the next few days, I started to feel this entity communicate with me as my grandfather. At first, it was a very emotional and nice feeling, and I remember having it explain things that only my grandfather would remember about our last time together. Over days, though, I did get a strange negative feeling from this thing. Some events that took place over the next few months are quite blurry, but I remember Casey having some events like the seizures in front of me, and she used me as a healer in a way. I never was scared for some reason and always remained calm, and she relied on me to protect her from these events. Eventually, we were on a trip with family at the beach when I, my brother, and Casey decided to use a Ouija board. It was during a storm, and there was a room that was kind of underground with a small window that was high up and on the ground level of an outside area and a door into the room. As soon as we started the Ouija board, there was a very intense feeling in the room, and before we could even start asking questions, the doorknob on the outside of the door fell off, and we heard it fall to the ground on the other side of the door, locking us in the room. My brother was panicking, and I just said, "It's okay, I'll climb through the window and let us out." I did that, and nothing else happened. We stopped the Ouija, but after that the entity that was acting as my granddad got very dark. It began to tell me that for me to unlock my full potential, I needed to make a big sacrifice, and eventually started to tell me I needed to kill my brother. I had nightmares of killing him and writing on the walls in blood, and had woken up feeling watched and was beginning to lose my calmness. Not long after, Casey broke up with my brother randomly and abruptly, leaving him in a deep depression. My brother and I began drinking together a lot in his room, and we had some very intense visits from the entity while drinking. My brother told me some of the things Casey would do, such as witchcraft rituals in the room, but my brother said he never had the entity speak to him but felt watched and felt it hated him. One night, I, my brother, and his friend Paul were drinking in his room, having a fun night, when I suddenly felt the entity in the room. And I saw Paul looking in that area. I felt it, and he suddenly began clenching his fists and breathing like he wanted to kill someone. I immediately grabbed Paul and comforted him. He started screaming at my brother, and after some time of me calming him down, my brother said, "What happened?" And he said, "I don't know, I just got this sudden urge to hurt you." We then explained everything we had been going through to him. I am skipping some other things that had happened through the next few months, but essentially more of the same stuff was happening. Then one night we had my brother, Paul, and two of my brother's other friends over, Frank and Kate. I had a very dark feeling about Frank all night. It was my first time meeting him. After drinking, Frank randomly stood up and went towards a bookshelf with a box cutter. I knew that he was being possessed as soon as he stood up, and as soon as he grabbed the knife, I bear hugged him from behind and grabbed the knife in his hand, and Paul rushed over and helped me overpower him, and we held him down. He acted as if he was calm, but I still had the feeling of the entity possessing him, but no one else felt that way. We all talked about what had been happening to us. This was a big thing for me because it proved that this must be real if 3 separate people now all had the urge to hurt my brother without them knowing anything prior. We all went to sleep and were awoken by Kate screaming. We woke up to Frank standing over her, masturbating. We all immediately kicked Frank out of the house, and I started to talk to this thing and said, "What are you? I want you out of here. I'm not scared of you, you have no power over me." It said to me, "I am evil. I was Hitler. I am Aleister Crowley," which to me didn't mean anything. I told my brother that, and he said, "That's that guy Led Zeppelin liked." From there, I researched Aleister Crowley and was having nightmares/astral projections of being in Aleister Crowley's house, looking for something and being followed by this entity. I was trying hard to get rid of the entity as it wanted people to hurt my brother. From what I could feel, it was jealous of my brother and loved Casey and wanted to have Casey to itself. We reached out to her, but she stopped talking to us. This was about a year after the initial events. Eventually, it began to become less intense and left us alone mostly, and I began to doubt it was even real and that I was just an imaginative kid. But over the next few years, I would get drunk at house parties or with friends and would get taken over by it, beating myself, smashing my head into doors and walls. It happened maybe 5 times over that 2-year period from 16 to 18, but that's really all. I then began smoking weed every day and stopped drinking. The next 3 years were just fun. I then had a girlfriend at age 20 who was very negative about my life, making me depressed and anxious. I was with her for 2 years and had nothing paranormal or strange happen. I had forgotten about that side of me. Then I met a friend at my job who was a Christian. His mother also worked with us and was a big member of her church. She eventually invited me, and I said yes. I remember feeling a resistance in me from this entity, but I ignored it, thinking I was just crazy. That didn't happen and wasn't real. I began to pray to God to get me out of this depression, and I had two strange events happen while praying. The first was on a hike by myself. I asked for a sign that you're watching me and you're real, and I got attacked by about 5 birds at that exact time. Then I was praying in the shower with my eyes closed and felt a negative energy and opened my eyes to see my girlfriend with her face pushed against the shower, looking like a demon. I screamed at her, and she got really upset. I then invited my girlfriend to my new Christian friends, Reno, house. We were smoking weed when all of a sudden Reno's brother got agitated and pulled a knife on his brother. My girlfriend freaked out and wanted to leave. As we were leaving, Reno's father-in-law stopped us and said to my girlfriend she is no longer welcome in the house, she has brought dark energy into the home. She was furious, as was I, and swore at him. I got in the car with her to leave when I said, "No, I want to go talk to him. It's wrong. They said they welcome everyone and then say you're not welcome." When I went inside to talk to them, the priest was there and came out of nowhere and said, "Leave, you're not welcome." It shocked me so much, and I felt this intense electrical shock in my whole body and fell to the floor. I was shaking and sweating, and the priest, Reno's mother, and aunt all grabbed me and were praying and screaming, "Leave this boy, you're not welcome in his body." I felt this entity again for the first time in years. It was screaming, burning, and I felt it being pulled out of my body into Reno's mother's hands, and I was in pain, burning. I suddenly had this urge to lie to them to make it stop, so I acted as if I were cured and began crying and saying, "Thank you so much, you saved me." We talked and cried for the next 30 minutes until I convinced them to let me leave. Once I left, I disconnected from Reno and never saw them again. The next 2 years, from 22 to 24, were horrible, the worst time of my life. I became insanely suicidal, shut off from everyone. My girlfriend cheated on me at 23, and I got worse. I broke up with her and had finally attempted ending and failed. I was then so desperate to get better that I left Canberra, where I grew up, and moved into a friend's house. Then I had the most amazing change. I stopped smoking weed, which I hadn't done since I was 18. I met my now current wife, and from 24 to now, at 30, I've had a normal life. I got a great job, got married, and 2 years ago had a kid. It has been a challenge, as my daughter was born with a genetic condition, and she needs a kidney transplant, and I will be her donor, which I'm in the process of now, but I am still happy with my life. Nothing paranormal happened since I moved to Sydney. However, over the last 2 months, I started to feel drawn to it and began questioning everything that happened back then, realizing some events that took place cannot be explained away. Then about a month ago, I was randomly invited to a concert by my brother and Paul. I had not seen Paul for the past 8 years, and right before I saw him, I was listening to a podcast, and as I'm walking into the concert, the podcast starts talking about Aleister Crowley, which made me so confused. What are the odds of that? Then after the concert, my brother starts telling me that he has begun thinking about Casey a lot recently and feels her visiting him in his dreams. He's also married with a kid, and he has not thought about those events for years but was always very skeptical it was ever real and more just us being imaginative and drunk young teens. But he said he's been thinking about the events and felt the same as I've felt recently, that some things can't be explained away that took place. Since then, I've been drawn to the subject and have kind of felt this entity hanging around me, silently kind of just watching me, which is where I'm at now, just beginning to revisit these periods of intense strangeness. I never really talked about this with anyone out of embarrassment, but want to be able to talk about it to see if anyone else has been through these experiences that may be able to shine a light on it for me. Thanks for listening.